conversation. So be free to engage through the, by asking and engaging the colleagues. A majority of them have got an experience in Europe, and then there's also in Africa, and we'll have a lot more, including sessions targeted at politicians, very soon as well, because we think it is important to have a conversation that just addresses at that at that level. So I'm going to take you through a very short presentation of the frontier that I am proposing on what will it take to make the government of national unity work. Please note that this is not a prescription on my part. It's a frontier, as I've indicated, albeit meant to shape the discourse in a much more structured format, so we can take things forward. And this, we must recall that the Constitution of the Republic, as I argue, already provides us with a good framework for how we can manage this phenomena that has managed. In the main, these sections of the Constitution, which are from Chapter 10, should be a reference point for all of us, especially the public servants. First of all, the Constitution says that public servants must loyally execute lawful policies of the government of the day. And there is no qualification here. It says they must loyally execute the policies of the government of the day. In this instance, the government of the day is the GNU, and I will explain later then how does the lawful policies of the government of the day become. And it says, no employee of the public service may be favored or prejudiced only because that person supports a particular political party. This is an important safeguard in the Constitution, in a sense that if a public servant who might have been seen attending a rally of another political party, you now have a political principle belonging to another party, you may not be prejudiced or favored as a consequence of that. However, there are other provisions of the Constitution that manages how we then behave as public servants once we are in office, because we are no longer activists of those political parties as public servants, just as much as ministers themselves, once they are in government, they are no longer activists of a specific political party. And the same chapter of the Constitution then contains basic values and principles governing public administration, organs of state and public enterprises. These are very important because they speak to issues of professionalism, how we conduct ourselves, how we treat the public, and how we relate to the responsibilities given to us as public servants. Fortunately, Cabinet in 2022 approved the professionalization framework, which was a significant milestone in terms of drawing parameters for further work that must be done to professionalize the civil service in South Africa, and also addresses issues of how to manage the pressures that public servants will experience and how public servants themselves ought to behave in relation to their responsibilities. I must state it now that there's 3 pieces of legislation that are before Parliament that will give effect to the significant provisions of the framework. Those include the Public Service Amendment Act, the PAMA bill, as well as a pioneering bill on the Public Service Commission, and these will give impetus to the proposals that are made in the professionalization framework. Of course, there's several other provisions of the framework that are being implemented through directives issued by the Department of Public Service and Administration, and those include extending a pre-entry examination system into the service performance management, as well as management of the career incidents, especially of those at the top echelons of the civil service. Now, let me come to what I call an 8 thesis of what will it take to make the government of national unity work. And this is at high level. There is an article I've done on it in News 24 last Friday, so you can go into a much more lengthier version of this. The first thesis is that this GNU, requires that the centrality of the architecture and structures of the decision-making must become very clear to all. This matters because, as I said earlier on, that public servants, the Constitution says they must loyally implement the legal program of the government of the day. In this instance, it then becomes the cabinet that becomes a clearing house. So all the decisions that cabinet has made, given the powers that vest in cabinet, they become the legal program or legal policies of the government of the day, and that as public servant, we must loyally execute it. It is important, therefore, that for the government of national unity to work, it must be clear that there is only one clearinghouse, and that is cabinet, and there is no other structure as such. And secondly, that for GNU to work, there must be an adoption of what I call a national development agenda, which means that the government program of action that will then be executed, which is a hybrid or a combination of manifestos of those parties that are now part of the GNU, will then constitute the legal program of the government of the day. And once that is adopted by cabinet and all parties to the GNU, then the entire system will follow and implement as such. So the biggest frontier at the moment, as cabinet has been set up, will be to finalize and adopt a national development agenda that is coherent. Everybody should support it, and of course, there must be resources appropriated to support. The third, thesis here is that it's important for the GNU to agree and adopt a national budget and how it's going to be distributed. This will obviate a situation where there are some who may feel that their departments may not be adequately funded, to a point where if they are aggrieved about it, then think it is inadequately funded because they may be belonging to a particular party. So it's important that there's got to be coherence in as far as the national budget is concerned, and that there must be some degree of transparency and equity. Fortunately, in a manner in which the budget system in South Africa works, it is very open, it's very transparent, and therefore there shouldn't be any feeling of exclusion. But linked to the national development agenda should then be a national budget that everybody can own and defend. The fourth thesis is about the realignment of departmental plans and towards the national development agenda. This is very important because it means myself as a director general, once the national development agenda is adopted, I need to be able to realign my own plans in the department, of course the budget as well, such that the plan of the department is responsive to the national development agenda and the priorities that have been set up. Otherwise, we'll be running a parallel system where my department or any other institution, for instance, is not aligned to what is the national development agenda. The fifth is the imperative of optimizing departmental structures. I know this is controversial, but it's got to be done. It cannot be that there is a significant change in the pursuit of the national development agenda, and then we keep the structures as they are. This does not mean about retrenchment and so on, but it may mean that there must be shifts that must happen within institutions, because once there's a new program of action, it may have a different type of emphasis. It may mean in some instances that when there were vacant posts in the past for people who may have a HR background, that in this instance going forward, you no longer employ people who may have HR background, but you may employ more engineers, more data scientists, and so on. And that restructuring is important as a way of responding to the national development agenda and its effective execution. Number 6, I'm proposing that we have to invest in building soft institutions, and I know some of the colleagues will talk about it here. We have to improve trust in the system. We are working with political principals who come from different backgrounds, different organizations, they've got different pressure points, and so there has to be a culture shift inside institutions themselves, such that we build a relationship of trust and a new type of relationships that are very effective. And then the second last thesis is working towards defining standard practice for higher levels of responsiveness. This is important to do because there will be instances where principals may want to respond in a particular way because they come from a particular background or political party, and they believe that in a manner in which they are responding, it is effective, and that may create challenges unless those modalities are worked out and agreed to within the department. Otherwise, this will create tensions between principals and DGs and CFOs because they may want to do things in a business as usual format when there are different exigencies. So there has to be clarity on these and the definition in order to improve respect as well. And the last thesis is I'm arguing that we have to institutionalize, a structured change management process. It must not be ad hoc. It must not be dependent on whether or not people have a predisposition for managing change in their institution. In that way, then we will know that across the system, there are modalities that are designed to respond to issues arising from the change, that must occur. And there's many things where in the past, in a kind of a single, party arrangement, there are certain access that people may have at a level of heads of departments. They may no longer have them. We must be clear about what will happen in Parliament, who attends what caucus and what study groups, because those are some of the arrangements that existed, in the past. And this change has to be managed in a much more active way than it being left to its own devices, because it will create problems. And finally, I am arguing that it's important that we build, consensus with very clear modalities, that the authorities must be clear and the responsibilities, because hierarchy does matter in a public, administration establishment. And it must be known that one cabinet as a clearinghouse has made a particular policy decision that has got to cascade and be implemented across the system, regardless of whether or not a person comes from a political party that does not believe in it, because that is not how cabinets work. Everybody in the system is severally and collectively, obliged to support and champion the program that has been approved by cabinet. And that parties must be willing to work towards a common purpose rather than using state institutions for partisan politics, because that can create many problems. And lastly, controversially, for a GNU to work, we need cool heads. Cool heads are important because the situation can become very tense, and it could become very dynamic, and you end up having conflict. So it is important that those who are part of the system appreciate the fact that you may have to work with others, even if it means you take more time to get a decision through, as opposed to how you might have done the same in a situation where people came from one political party, because there's other structures where they will have cleared things prior to them coming into the system. So I'm proposing this as a kind of a frontier of how we must look at building the modalities for keeping the system to work. This will be evolving, as I said, as frontiers need to evolve anyway. And then we will get some of the feedback we will get from those who have gone through this before, and we will evolve it going forward. Otherwise, thank you very much once again, colleagues, for being here, and we're looking forward to an exciting session this morning. Dr. Kaunda, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Principal, for the scene setting and those thoughts outlining our new difficult reality. We now move on to the first part of our program, which is lessons, learning from global experiences on coalitions and the impact on bureaucracies. We have a distinguished panel who will outline their views and thoughts and experiences on it. We have Mr. Fergus Finlay, who will start as a former advisor to coalition governments in Ireland. We have Mr. Jan Corneli, who is a former chef de cabinet or chief of staff for various Belgian ministers, including the vice prime minister. There's Professor Maxime, professor of political science from the University of Liège in Belgium. There's Professor Andrea Lippi from the National School of Administration, our sister institution in Italy. Ms. Ntabiseng Tlomola, who is the DG for another sister institution of ours, the Lesotho Institute of Public Administration and Management. Dr. Muchemwa Sinkala from NIPA, our sister institution in Zambia. That's our distinguished panel who will then share our experiences and thoughts with us. Without much time, let me hand over to Mr. Finlay, the former advisor to coalition governments in Ireland, for his presentation. Over to you, Fergus.
Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think on my screen the sun appears to be shining right on me, so I hope that, let's see if I can move into a bit of shade. Now, it's very, very seldom that you get a bright early morning sun in Ireland, so I'm going to make the most of it. I'm not sure that I have any really strong lessons to impart, but I do think that perhaps it is worth reflecting on what has been a long experience of coalitions. I should start by saying that in Ireland, for most of our political history, there was one, and I'm not drawing any comparisons or parallels. In Ireland, for most of our political history, there was one dominant political party, which was in government for long periods of time. And almost the only way to get them out of government was to form a coalition in order to remove them. So for a lot of our political history, our coalitions were defined by what they were opposed to rather than what they were trying to achieve. We had coalition governments in the 40s and the 50s for most of 100 years that had one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to give the governing party a period in opposition. But that has all changed in Ireland now. In Ireland, the reality is coalition government now. Perhaps since the economic crash that befell the whole world in 2008, 2010, 2011, no political party in Ireland is likely ever to have that kind of dominant position again. So the entire political system has had to adapt and adjust and learn how to make coalitions work. And they haven't always worked, but those that have worked have had a number of, I guess, features in common. I worked for 3 coalition governments in the 80s and in the 90s, twice in the 90s. And I have watched and observed and participated in coalition governments ever since, on the periphery, as it were. I also write a lot about politics, so I talk to a lot of politicians at all times. So this is what I guess I have learned. Learned it directly from our own direct experience. I worked all my political life for the Irish Labour Party, which, although it has had some great periods of success, has tended to be a minority party. It has tended to be a 10 to 15% party, and therefore has tended always to be the minor party in a coalition government. And that's a very uncomfortable and difficult place to be. The 3 governments that I worked for, Labour was in the minority. And it could be said that we suffered. My former boss, a man called Dick Spring, used to say that Labour got 10% of the vote, but 90% of the blame for everything that went wrong. And there's some bit of truth in that. The minority party tends to suffer, not always, but tends to suffer, and there are reasons for that, I think. But let me just talk about the first coalition government that I worked for. It was formed in order to get the dominant party, Fianna Fáil, out of office. That was its primary purpose and its primary objective. And it was a government that came into office after a period of very considerable political and financial scandal, and spent 4 years, as it were, trying to fix the mess that had been left behind, and was then swept back out of office and replaced again by the dominant party. We had a program, we had good relationships, but we had no real purpose in that coalition government other than to be against the dominant party. That was our primary purpose. And I learned that what I think was the important lesson, that isn't enough, that there is absolutely no point in being in government just to stop somebody else being in government. That just doesn't achieve anything. So the next time we had a chance to form a government, I was one of the people who insisted that this time we would have a program and a system to deliver that program, and a proper structure to deliver that program. So we had in the 90s, we had a very detailed written program, and we set up a structure. We appointed a system of what were called, they were new in Ireland, they'd never been appointed before, what were called program managers, to work hand in glove with the civil service. They were political appointees, but their job was to work with the civil service and the public service around the program, to deliver the program. They weren't there to make political points or to engage in political activity other than programmatic political activity. So we set up this one in every government department. We told them all that one of their first jobs was to develop trust and respect within the public service. That the public service had to understand that they were there not to undermine, not to get in the way, not to insist on, doing political favors or anything of that kind. That their only purpose was the delivery of the program. At the end of that period of government, it was written by some seasoned political correspondents that government had actually delivered 90% or more of its program. And that structure was a very significant part of the reason. But that government failed because despite the success of the program, the relationships between the principals of that government became corroded by distrust and lack of mutual respect. And the government fell apart. Not in scandal as much, but in over a very, very unseemly political row about the appointment of members of the judiciary and related matters. And this was then replaced by another coalition government, which adopted the same program essentially. The first government in the 90s that I worked for you would describe as a centre-left government. The second government you would describe perhaps more as a centre-right government. We were the left element of it, but the other element was a conservative party. And for some peculiar reason, it worked much, much better. It delivered its program. It kept the structure. It honored all the commitments it made. And the main reason it was a success was because the principals learned to trust and work together. They came from a position of political enmity to a position of mutual respect over a very short period of time. And to me, that is one of the great lessons of that period of government. The other thing that happened, of course, in those years was the capacity of government to manage events is always determined by the character of the government, by the way in which people can work together, can get together at short notice, can deal with problems, if not on the basis of agreed solutions, then all must always agree on the basis of agreed analysis. So, as you will know, the government of Ireland in the 80s in particular, politics was dominated by the situation in Northern Ireland, by the violence and the conflagration that occurred in Northern Ireland. And in the 90s, dominated by the search for a ceasefire and the beginnings of a peace process. And those issues, those huge issues, which were bigger than anything else we dealt with, had the capacity to drive people apart, but actually had the effect of forcing people to share a huge amount of common ground. The efforts that began in the 80s and culminated in the 90s resulted in a completely agreed analysis of how to solve the problem. And it became a different, the analysis, the deeper it got and the more complex it became, suddenly it became a totally different approach. So in the 80s, for example, all of the political system in Ireland was completely agreed on the need to marginalize what I will call the paramilitary organizations, the men of violence, the people who were involved in what they called the war. In the 90s, the agreed strategy suddenly changed, and it changed almost by stealth because nobody wanted to say it out loud. But the truth was, the entire political system agreed that it was now important and necessary to try to work with the men of violence, to try to bring the men of violence in from the cold, and to get them around the table to the maximum possible extent. And that has resulted over time in a third phenomenon, which is the phenomenon of Northern Ireland, where there is a power sharing government now in place, and where the rules of that power sharing government are such that everybody must be in government. Everybody is allocated a seat in government as in proportion to the seats, the votes they got in the previous election. But everybody's in government and nobody's in opposition. And that presents enormous challenges of trust and relationships and so on. At the end of the day, the key thing about coalitions, in my experience, is relationships. It is not victories. It's not one side dominating the other side. It is an acceptance that you're not going to get everything you want in a coalition. It is an acceptance that each side, even if you're not going to give them everything they want, you are going to respect their bottom lines, their red circles, the things that they must have to feel that participation, was worthwhile. And above and beyond that, there has to be a very, very strong element of personal trust. It is said often in Ireland that the most successful government we ever had was the one that engineered the IRA ceasefire, but that government fell apart on the basis of acrimony and distrust between its two principals, and therefore cannot be described as a success. So my experience would suggest that relationships and trust are absolutely essential, that a written program is absolutely essential, that a detailed structure to get that program implemented is absolutely essential. But there is no guarantee in the end of success unless there is trust and mutual respect. That's all I wanted to say for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the input, Mr. Finlay. We now move from Ireland to Belgium. Mr. Jan Connelly, the former Chief of Staff to the Vice Prime Minister and other leaders. Over to you.
Thank you. And I will share a presentation. So I hope you see it. Good morning, all. So indeed, I'm Jan Corneli from Belgium. I've been advisor.
Good morning, Mr. Jan.
Yes.
Hi, you're sharing the wrong screen with us. We're sharing, you can just click at the top, go to display setting. At the top of your screen where you're seeing the screen with your notes. Yeah, go to display settings, click on that, and you want to duplicate it.
Okay. Sorry for that.
You're sharing. Okay.
So now I stopped sharing. I'll try to share again. I think this should be better.
You can go to presentation mode.
Stop video presentation mode, but don't see that. No, this needs work. Okay, just a second.
To save time, if there's a struggle with that, we can just go ahead.
No, it will work.
You may continue. I will share it for you.
Okay, good. Okay, sorry for that. So good morning, Jan Corneli here from Belgium. I've been advisor to the government and to the Flemish Socialist Party, which is a sort of traditional center-left party in Europe and Belgium, in the Flemish region of Belgium. And I have been active in government through several coalitions and as a negotiator, negotiated government, a regional government and a national government, also negotiated state reform and a new financing law of the region. So if we go to the next slides, I think the president, in his speech last week, referred to Belgium as an example, or not as an example, for the very long coalition negotiations, which lasted 514 days. Now, obviously, Belgium is very much known for coalition government. Since one man, one vote was introduced in 1919, so more than 100 years ago, there were only 4 years and 4 months without coalition government. All the other years, there have been a coalition, mostly between Catholics, Christian Democrats, which was the dominant party in Flanders, and liberals and socialists, or both. That was until 1999. Since 1999, we've also seen governments without the dominant party of Christian Democrats, and coalitions between socialists and liberals, and also with ecologists and regionalists. Now, the main, and that's the first takeaway, I think, from Belgian coalition government, is that coalitions were used to pacify across main political fault lines. And this is very important because through the history of Belgium, there were intense fault lines in the population between various political and societal tendencies, and coalition government managed to pacify them. And the main ones in Belgium, at least, were first the religious one. The Catholic Church dominated not only religion, but also most of the school system and most of the healthcare system. And so basically the non-Catholics tried to, via the state, build also a school and a healthcare system which was more liberal, more universal than the Catholic one. And that has led to pacification across these healthcare and school systems, which was basically made in government, that kind of pacification. The second one was the socioeconomic, between typically the left, worker rights, social security, and the right, more business, industry, and competitiveness oriented. And the third fault line is the communitarian one, which is typically Belgian, is between those who want to devolve more power to the regions of Belgium and those who want to keep more power at the federal level. Now, across the Belgian history, coalitions made deals around these fault lines in order to keep Belgium going, in order to advance the economy, the well-being of the population. And it has to be said that has worked pretty well. Now, coalition government is not easy. And as the president referred to the longest negotiation in which I took part, I sat through this whole negotiation as one of the chief negotiators for my party. It lasted 514 days. It was excruciating, but we managed to get a coalition agreement. We managed to agree on a state reform, and we managed a new financing law which finances basically the regional governments of the country. And that was very important because it pacified a situation that had occurred because of the rise of the nationalists in Flanders that wanted more, basically wanted to pursue a more separatist agenda. Now, that's very important because pacification is key. Now, I'm going to turn to 5 lessons from my experience, and that's the next slide. 5 lessons from my experience in negotiation and in government. So the first is, well, it's important to discuss coalition agreement before entering a government. Now, I know that's too late because the coalition of national unity has been formed. Everyone's in it. But it's mainly because what the previous speaker said, it's to protect the minority parties in government. Because if you want it or not, if you enter a government, you must be able to explain why you are there, what are your red lines, what do you compromise on, and what is so essential that you cannot compromise on. So this is important, and a real coalition agreement takes that into account and makes of all these building blocks, all these red lines and so forth, creates a space in which a coalition agreement can be found that lasts until the next election. Because basically the next election starts the day after the last election, and every party will try to position itself for the next election in order to gain votes, perhaps for the dominant party to regain absolute majority, or for other parties to advance through participation in government. And that's so discussing this coalition agreement is important. And we saw that in 2010, the UK, which had typically an alternating government, there was no party with an absolute majority, so there was a coalition between the Conservatives of David Cameron and the Liberal Democrats. They made a coalition in 5 days without discussing real policy detail. The end of that situation was that the Lib Dems crushed to defeat in the next election, and the Conservatives won again their absolute majority. Now that's great for the Conservatives. After that, they decided on a Brexit referendum, but that's not the topic of today. But that's really, if you're a Liberal Democrat, you say, I'm not going to do that again. Next time I enter a government, I will discuss what is essential to me. Now, the second point I want to raise is, as a civil service, as sort of experts on policy matters, as administrators, you need to respect that there's a political need to make compromises and institutionalize it, because pacification is a key outcome in itself. You want the country to be pacified in order to be able to make policy and to implement rational and good policies that advance the country. So pacification is in itself an outcome of coalition government if it's well done. Now, you need to respect that. For that, political parties need to compromise. Now, obviously, you need also to reduce that scope a little bit, because I give an example. Typically, a political compromise would be, we would introduce a carbon tax and nobody will feel it. That's typically what politicians like as a compromise. But that's obviously not true. Someone will feel it. And that's where you, as experts, as civil servants, need to stand up and say, well, you can compromise on a carbon tax or another system of taxation, but you need to keep in mind some facts. And that's my third my third lesson learned. As a civil service, as experts, as advisors in governments, you need to limit the zone of possible agreements through facts and constraints. Now, I'm making a reference here to negotiation theory. The zone of possible agreement is basically what you get if you add all the negotiation positions of the different parties and government partners. And then, obviously, the realm of possible compromises is vast. I mean, politicians are very inventive in making compromises or finding compromises that are just not realistic, untenable, unimplementable, unrealistic in timing, in budget, in technicality, sometimes even unlawful. So you need to limit that zone of possible agreements by introducing facts and constraints into that discussion. And that's, as a civil service, you want to obviously point out what is legal and what is not, what is budgetary feasible, what is implementable. You could say, oh, I give another extreme example. We will make sure that there's a railway station within 5 kilometers of every major village. Now, obviously, that's impossible. It's impossible even in 20 years, and budgetary, it's nonsense. Even in transport ways, it's probably not a good idea. Now, that can be a compromise that politicians think, okay, that keeps the balance between the parties, but it's just unfeasible. So you need to insert facts and constraints into the discussion without foregoing or without leaving the politicians and the parties of the government in the position that they cannot make compromises anymore. So you don't want to fix them on their positions and say there's only one option. No, there are different options. There are different policy orientations that you can have. There are different compromises that you can have, but they need to be reasonable. They need to be rational. And I give one example of that. I discussed with a Dutch colleague at some point, and he said that the Dutch civil service, they prepared on the basis prior to elections, they prepared 3 versions of a coalition agreement: a center-right one, a center one, and a left one. And then they looked at the score, and then they said, okay, we take out this left one or the center-right one. And then here's the plan you can make. They go to the parties forming the coalition, and they say, well, if you want to do something reasonable and well prepared, this is what you can do. Because implementation is an important factor of political life and is an important element of policy making. And that's what, especially as a civil service and as responsibles for the good implementation of policies, you need to stand up for. Now, so it also means you need to project yourself into the heads of the political partners and try to think with them what is their objective, what do they really want, and perhaps there's a better way of getting there, and I can suggest that better way, which is perhaps part of the better compromise that you can make. So facts and constraints are key. You need to stand up for them, but you also need to prepare for them to be able to not lose the connection with the political world. Because if the political world starts distrusting the civil service because they say, they always say no, and they always come with facts, and I can never implement my policy, and they always say that it's impossible what I propose, or that it's unlawful, or that there's no budget for it, and so forth, then basically the political world starts alienating itself from the civil service, and you lose the ability to influence. And there, you don't want to be in that spot. You want to keep the connection, however hard it can be, however much you might not like some of the politicians, ministers that you need to work for. But you need to keep the connection, because the connection gives you leverage and influence. And that's very important to do your job. Now, a fourth element I want to point out is you need to provide an overarching narrative in which governing parties can find themselves. And I heard the first speaker on Professor Busani on the National Development Agenda. Now, that's very important that you make not just an agenda, but the agenda also includes a compromise along the fault lines of the country. And I've talked about the Belgian fault lines, which I know very well. South Africa has other fault lines, but you need to reflect on how do I make a real compromise, not just a superficial one. And I give the example typically around the economy, competitiveness, jobs. Typically, the right will say, well, our enterprises, our industry, our commerce need to be competitive. So we need to have more lax labor regulation. We need to have the freedom to fire and hire. We need to be able to pay low taxes because otherwise we will not stand in the global economy. Now, obviously, it's important to have a flourishing business sector and an industry that is internationally competitive. But obviously, that's where the right has a point, but the left also has a point. Namely, why do we want that? Well, to advance our economy, to advance workers' living, to advance purchasing power by the workers, to basically build a community of people in which work is valued, but is also a way to progress in life. So the left has a point, the right has a point. Now, how do you compromise in the current situation of the world? And what is your overarching narrative of getting there? What is your priority? I give the example of Belgium in the 90s. Our priority was to be a member of the euro. And we were not passing the test at the beginning of that process. Our national debt was too high. Our deficit was too high. We were not very competitive. So we had a 10-year plan to enter into the euro. And even though our debt was still too high at the end of the 10-year, we made significant progress that allowed us to enter the euro, which was key for our position as an open economy in the eurozone. So that's a narrative which cannot go on for decades, but it can go on for 10 years, where you say, this is our priority. Afterwards, it was more about the active welfare state. We have a good social security, a welfare state, but the consensus was that it needed to be more active. There needed to be more incentives to get into jobs and not live off allowances. Now, that was a consensus left and right. There were some let's say, some different interpretations of that. But in the end, we agreed right and left on the fact that our welfare state is valuable, but it needs to be active. And that was a real compromise across fault lines between the economic right and the social left. Now, my last point is in order to be able to make good compromises and to be prepared for it, you need to make use of the nation's centers of excellence in policymaking and provide access to chief advisors from all governing parties. And that's, there's a little technocratic element in there, but you do want your political advisors, so not the ministers if you want, although obviously it's also important that they are included in that, but sort of the people advising the ministers, the political activists who are joining the government in some way or another in an advising role. You want them to also be educated in the facts and the constraints and sort of the economic view on policy making and so forth, because it's important that everyone has the same facts and figures and understands where to get those and have access to those, because you don't want to deprive some of the parties of the knowledge that is needed to be a responsible governing party. And there, in the Belgian situation again, and I'm pretty sure it's different in South Africa, but for instance, in Belgium, the central bank is basically the nation's biggest think tank. It's slightly outside of its scope of monetary stability, but it has its role. It combines basically all the brightest economic minds of the country, and their advisors are linked to political parties, so everyone has more or less access to it. And when we were discussing 10 years ago the new financing law in Belgium, basically the only instance that was trusted to make the model, to make simulations of the impact of that financing law, was the National Bank, together with the Planning Bureau, Economic Planning Bureau. And their model was used by all parties, the same model. The basis for the negotiation, the facts and figures that underpin this negotiation, was basically the same for everyone by a trusted source. And everyone could go and discuss with the expert of the bank, what does this mean? What happens if I do this? You could, run simulations and so forth. Now that's very important because, government is not done by ministers alone. Government is not done by cabinet alone. You need a whole world and ecosystem of advisors, of civil service, of national expert bodies, of representatives of sectors, but also of political advisors that talk to each other, that trust each other, that know, like, okay, we disagree on this, but let's agree at least on some of the facts that are out there and that are indisputable. And that's important because you don't want fact-free political compromises. You want people to be educated in real, let's say, a sound scientific basis for policy making. And their centers of excellence are important. If you don't have them, you need to create them, or you need to sort of pool the resources together of different centers of excellence and say, well, we together, we will support national unity government with all the scientific facts and theories and policy relevant research that is available to us, because it's important service to the nation. So those are my 5 lessons learned. I can talk for hours and days about this, but that's a snapshot. I'm happy to take questions later and discuss it further when there's room for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that input. You spoke about negotiations that ran for 514 days. I'm sure South Africans here were horrified because 2 weeks felt like a very, very long time for us. Yeah. So that was scary. Let me just indicate that please jot down the questions there. The Q&A is open. At the end of this segment, we'll be taking questions and comments. The panelists will be responding. So make use of that Q&A to jot down your comments and questions. For the next speaker, we are staying in Belgium. We're moving from government now to academia, to Professor Maxime Fournet from the University of Belgium. Over to you for your input. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been like 3 presentations and it's already really interesting, and I try not to denote and of course not to have too much overlap with what Jan Colony just said. Was really interesting, and I try to have some kind of another angle. Because the thing is, I've been active studying administrative issues as a scholar, but I've also worked for the last 2 years as a political advisor at another governmental level at Etienne Cornely, which was at the French-speaking community government for the Green Party. And actually, it helps me to build another understanding of the links between coalition governments and um, and public servants. As Jan said, coalitions are really at the center of anything in Belgium. There's nothing going on without having some kind of a political balance, of a partisan balance in mind. And that has been the case since the beginning of the 20th century, because the logic of a national unity government was in the heart of the Belgian independence. And as Fergus Finlay said, sometimes these coalition, these agreements was more about what we were against. The first thing was the Dutch state, because Belgium was born as an independent state from the Netherlands power. And at that time, the logic behind administration was really the most direct hierarchical state you could imagine. There was the person of a king was the head of the administration, and the constitutional texts still state that, but nowadays it's very different. But the thing is, the head of state was actually ruling even tiny pieces of Belgium governance, and you can even find some letters from the king talking about how the streets should be designed. And it's really interesting to see how this king's power has decreased through the years through two massive dynamics. The first of which was democracy. Jan Cornely told there was almost always a coalition beginning from 1919, which is actually the moment where all men were allowed to vote. Before that, it was a tax qualification vote, meaning that only 1% of Belgian population was allowed to vote. And at that time, all public servants had a direct oath of obedience to the king. In the beginning of the 20th century and the second state reform in 1921, the oath was transformed into a constitutional oath, which means we have to respect the whole balance of the state and its several divides. At that point, administration was no longer only seen as a tool in the hands of a ruler, but as a tool for the public good. So you have a democratic shift. This democratic shift was really, really hardly impacted by the partitocratic shift, which is that all of Belgian policies were balanced between different divides. The first of which was, as Jan Cornely said, the divide between Catholics and anti-Catholics. For a few decades at the end of the 19th century, there was some kind of an alternation between Catholic power and liberal power. The first political party created was the Liberal Party, and each time they were at power, they wanted to have a strong government. Whereas where the Catholic were at power, they wanted to have more place for Catholic organization. We talked about schools. It was the same thing about administration. So at some point, we had to shift in order to overpass this kind of spoiled system, more or less, which existed in the 19th century. And so there was the time for the birth of the classical hierarchical administration. All public servants were appointed by the central authority. These officials were known as neutral and irremovable. It was a career, a lifelong career, as long as you were nominated in the first part. And all these people were thought as the embodiment of the state strength. Funnily enough, when the overarching narrative was about entering the EU, as Jan said, was really interesting. And there was a shift in the way of seeing social security. So at the end of the 20th century, the years 1990s, there was also a big, massive shift in administration, which is the introduction of new public management principles. So more or less neoliberalism translated in terms of administrative action in all of the Belgian levels of governments. At that point, nominations were rethought to be based on special technocratic juries, which was quite new at that time. There was a huge emphasis on efficiency of administration, also linked, of course, to the goals regarding public debt. And a new tool was introduced, which was time-limited mandates. In the head of administration, most people were now appointed for a limited time, for, it says, 5 years. This logic of limiting time was really strongly linked to politicization. Because from the very beginning, even with a really clear hierarchical rule, the most powerful parties always wanted to appoint their own people inside the administration. And there was a huge debate actually to say, okay, how should we deal with that? And one of the answers found was to say, maybe instead of having irremovable officers at all levels of government, we should allow people to be nominated for a certain amount of time, which at the same time is avoiding people to stay, people with a really marked partitocratic etiquette, for example, to stay for so long, but also on the other hand, it allows the ministers, the actual head of government, to appoint people at the end of an era, and therefore have a point of power outside from the government, but inside the administration. And this, of course, can be multiplied following all the divides in Belgium. There are different kind of governments, but inside them, all the political divide can be really stressed out by these arrangements. And so this policy system temptation is really at the heart of the debate at the end of the legislators, which was now in Belgium. The last months were really active in terms of who should we appoint where. And some of these reassignments from political advisors are really formal. Some are, of course, absolutely not formal. And one of the massive game inside the coalitions, which with way fewer parties than what we have here in South Africa, is partitocratic dealings, to say if someone is nominated, I'll nominate someone else elsewhere. And of course, this can lead to administrative resistance. I'm talking in midterm. It's possible for administrative officials to counteract political decisions. The first and the easiest and the most common way to do so is through passive resistance. Some administration can take their time, can procrastinate, can set other priorities and have their own agenda. On the other hand, at the governmental level, it's really possible to avoid giving direct decision to the administration. And for a certain numbers of analysis, it's possible not to go through administrative ways. And talking about the projection for the financing law, Jan Corneli told us that both the Federal Planning Bureau and the Central Bank Bureau were instrumental to analyze all possible scenarios, which is actually true, absolutely true. But in lots of other fields, one of the tactics of the governments to avoid a possible resistance from administration is to go through private components and consulting agencies, which is interesting. But something I think which is usually forgotten is that government administration are not in a constant struggle. Of course, when we talk about issues, that's what we have in mind, and they can reinforce. And something which I believe will be really important in South Africa and elsewhere where there's coalition and large coalition, is that usually ministers are acting as advocates to their own sectors and to their own administration. And I think that is absolutely central to what we will be working with everywhere. And it actually is quite parallel to what Fergus Finlay said, which is third thesis, with the firm agreement on budget. At the Belgian level, the biggest moment of every year is the moment where we discuss budget. And at these specific times, all the administrative work and efforts to have clear figures of what they are needing is the first and foremost input for the political decision. And I think, of course, there are some difficulties sometimes to translate political decisions into public action, and of course, the other ways around is also true. But there's a way to see that ministers are actually acting for their own administration and sectors. This is also a difficulty because as you widen the political parties acting, as you divide, as you atomize the competencies, all decisions at the governmental level can be polluted by specific interests, which is one of the biggest issues I have witnessed as a political advisor, and I really hope that it will be easier for all of you in South Africa. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that input. And another reminder again that the Q&A is open to engage with all these presentations, from the one of Professor Busani to all our distinguished panelists who are sharing so much expertise and knowledge for us. We're moving from Belgium to Italy now, to Professor Andre Lippi from the National School of Administration. Could we have that presentation? Thanks.
Good morning. I'm Andrea Lippi. I'm full professor of political science at the University of Florence and coordinator of the Public Policy and Governance Department at the National School of Administration, Rome. I thank the National School of Government of the Republic of South Africa for inviting me to this webinar, and I'm going to share my presentation about the role of Italy in the relationship between the coalition governments and the role of bureaucracy. I think that Italy matters a lot when talking about the relationships between coalition governments and bureaucracy in general. But before talking about the case of Italy, I think that's relevant to keep in mind some relevant elements about the different role of bureaucracy in Westminster and so-called consensual democracies. As you know, government grounded on coalitions are typical of consensual democratic regimes, and they are very, very, very well known in Europe, like in the case of Italy, of course, with a strong tradition, and in Germany or in the Netherlands or in Belgium. Here we know we are coping with specific activities where the role of the bureaucracy is very relevant because we are facing to some recurrent features. I tried to sum up some of them through a list of relevant aspects for us now. First of all, we have to keep in mind that in a consensual democratic regime, we are looking at a fragmented distribution of power and a check and balance between different types of power according to the division inside the governments, inside the party system. Very fragmented party system and very fragmented coalitions are reflected by a very fragmented distribution of power. An Italian political scientist labeled this as the politics of fragmentation. And so we have a check and balance among institutional bodies, agencies, ministries, a very large number of ministries, and there are so-called plural governments. And this pluralism is reflected in the very fragmented approach in the public administration at central level. A second point is very relevant. The most part of these countries is belonging the so-called Napoleonic approach of bureaucracy, belonging the Napoleonic tradition. Here, you are looking at the very relevant particularity, the role of the cabinets. The cabinets are staff office politically appointed by the ministry, by the ministers, and the cabinets are very relevant since the 19th century. The politicization of the heads of the cabinets is a very strong tradition. The head of cabinets are traditionally coming from the career of judges, of the top civil servants, of lawyers, and they are politically appointed by the ministers in TAR for the time the minister is in charge, and the head of the cabinets have some collaborators to support the minister in a very relevant activity. This activity is the brokering between the representative body, I mean the minister, and the bureaucracy. This brokering is very relevant and very well suitable for government coalition because the head of cabinets are very important player in brokering. And here is a very relevant that the head of the cabinets had a very traditional profile as a legal supervisor. They were traditionally lawyers. But apart from this second point, we have a third point that's very important. In this type of countries, like Italy, we have a very important role of bureaucratic politics. I mean that the bureaucratic politics is the political role of bureaucrats inside the public administration, in relation with other ministries, with other public agencies, and externally, in front of groups of interest, for instance. And also in terms of participatory influence in budgeting administration and lobbying. Last but not least, we have also some recurrent side effects. Coalition governments induced a very relevant side effect in terms of party patronage at the top, and sometimes also at the bottom. And it's a very latent, formal or informal, sometimes visible, spoil system. Italy is a case in point. First of all, Italy is very relevant because of the change the country experienced in the latest 30 years. We experienced three relevant changes. First of all, a very relevant change in the party system, and it entailed also a change of the electoral system. And secondly, we experienced a change in the polity and moving from a unitary state to a multi-level system, a so-called quasi-federalism, a stronger regionalism. The strong regionalism pertained to very new skills at the center in terms of bargaining and brokering between the states and the regions and the municipalities. Municipalities are very influential in Italian politics. And the last change is very important for bureaucrats because we experience a smooth but very influential effect by new public management reforms since the 90s. And these reforms encouraged the top civil servants in their role, and the top civil servants improved their role. They became professionals. We also observed that transformation of the cabinets. They abandoned the traditional legal supervision approach, and they became more relevant, wider, with more employees, and they abandoned the legal supervision, and they became brokering roles. Nowadays, the head of cabinets are very relevant, broker inside the governments, mediating and bargaining with the bureaucrats, the different ministries, and the different ministers belonging to different parties. And so it also included a professionalization of top civil servants to strategic roles. Nowadays, we can look at public managers as they are becoming public stakeholders of policymaking. And so we are also observing an increasing of the relevance of informal relationships, beside of the formal ones, of course. The role of networking, the role of governance among ministries, and the multi-level governance between the state, the regions, and municipalities. And so we have also new relationships, which is the type of relationships between representative bodies and the bureaucrats, and new problems, of course, a problem of accountability, a problem of delegation of responsibility from the politicians to the top civil servants, and a role of new skills for bargaining, because the bureaucrats need to be able to bargain. And last but not least, we have the problem of the need for legitimation of the role of these new public institutions. A new arrangement, a new legitimation is needed. The traditional legitimacy envisaged by the Constitution is not still sufficient. So, what the contribution of Italy? I think that's the most relevant aspect, that we have an increasing relevance of soft power in place of or beside of the traditional hard power by statutes. Soft power means new soft skills, the capacity for mediating, the capacity for communication, capacity for reading the context, the capacity for managing human resources. And so we have a new stream of skills, and we have a new policy training in favor of top civil servants, not only legal competence, but also economics, policy analysis, ethics, communication, management. And so we also a need for increasing the new legitimation of the role of civil servants in face of politics and in society at the same time. And we have also observing an increasing role of the evidence-based policymaking, the role of evaluation, of policy advice, the power of government, participatory procedures, and multi-level governance, and the capacity for mediating the state between the state and the regions and the municipalities at the same time. So I think that Italy is a laboratory nowadays, a laboratory for top civil servants as a mediator of the political system, something like a supplementary professionalism for the weakness of politicians. It doesn't mean that nowadays top civil servants are called to replace politicians, of course. It means that we need for additional policy capacity a new legitimation process. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation from Prof. Andrea Lippi from the National School of Administration in Italy. We now move back home to the continent, to Lesotho, a presentation from Ms. Ntabiseng Hlomula, who is the Director General for the Lesotho Institute of Public Administration and Management. Over to you, ma'am.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Program Director, fellow panelists, fellow participants. Good morning. I'm going to share Lesotho experience, and thank you very much for the opportunity. We are just going to share with you how we have been surviving during the coalition government. We are not going to say what works, what doesn't work, but just how we have been ensuring that government business moves as expected. All right, just a little background about Lesotho, that we are a high altitude country. For those who may not be aware, landlocked, we have a population of around 2.2 million. We have the size of the public services, 45,983, made up of all the civil servants, teachers, defense, police, LCAs, and everyone. So sorry about that glitch.
Click on the slide.
Yeah. So a little bit about our electoral system. We have a mixed member proportion model, which is a combination of what you call first past the post, which was used some time back, but had to be replaced because of some challenges, and also proportional representation, where in the National Assembly we have about 120 seats, where 80 members are elected basically from their constituencies using just simple majority, while the other 40 are elected through proportional representation based on the number of votes the parties have garnered countrywide. So we find that even those who were not able to maybe win in the constituencies, but they still have supporters, many supporters around the country. So they have to be accommodated to share the views of their supporters. So I would like again to just give an idea about the rise of coalition governments in Lesotho. It started in 2012 when the general elections at the time produced a hang government where no single party could be able to form government, because we have 120 seats. A leading party is supposed to have at least 60+1 in order to form government. So during those elections, we did not have such a party. As a result, political parties were forced to come together to engage in talks to form government, based, of course, on their manifestos. So our manifestos, or the manifestos of our political parties, are more or less the same, because interest is basically on infrastructure development, job creation, and in general, growing the economy. So up to now, we are in the 5th coalition government. The first one, as I said, started in 2012, and it ran up to 2015, just about 2 years. And in 2015, we had to go for snap elections, which produced more or less the same results, because we had to go for coalition government again, the second one, which ran from 2015 to 2017. And then 2017, about again after 2 years, it collapsed, and we were forced to go for snap elections again, which also led us into the 3rd coalition government, running from 2017 to 2020. In 2020, that was just around 3 years. In 2020, we didn't go for elections, but the change happened in government, in parliament rather. So we had a new prime minister and a new composition of coalition government. So that was the fourth coalition government, which ran from 2020 to 2022, which was the end, because it was the end of 5 years. Parliament is supposed to take 5 years. So we had to go for elections at the end of 2022, which led us to the fifth coalition government, which is running now. So we are more than 10 years coalition governments. So that is why we have a little bit to share to our fellow countries. So maybe my starting point here could be to state that, as it was already stated by Professor NSG, that the role of professional public officers is basically to serve the government of the day. So we are required to be apolitical. So the first point here is the role of leadership. When talking about top leadership here in Lesotho, we're talking about the principal secretaries who come directly below the ministers. So these positions are supposed to be non-political in as far as our Public Service Act is concerned. But for a long time, their advancement in the public service has been influenced by their political affiliations. And you find most of them being replaced whenever a new coalition party gets to power. But starting with this current coalition government, we noted a change where the positions of principal secretaries were advertised, and their engagement was basically based on merit. As a result, many people who were holding those positions who are viewed as not political, the DPSs, were able to apply for positions of PSs and were very successful, which was good because they have very much experience in as far as public sector is concerned. So during the period of change, these non-political appointees, the DPSs and the directors, played a very big role in ensuring that the government agenda is driven, of course, in their acting capacities. And they were able to achieve this mainly because of the availability of our guiding documents. So here I'll talk to our National Development Strategic Plan, which was a document that was developed through public participation, where all stakeholders were involved: the academia, the political parties, the civil society, all members of the general public were involved in drawing this NSDP, which was basically trying to provide direction for government, not government per se, but at national level, as to where we want to go as a country in terms of economic development. So there are clearly stipulated functions in there for all ministers of government, that Minister of Works has to focus on this, Minister of Public Service, Minister of Finance, and everyone. So it's an all-encompassing document. So the importance of this document is that it ensures alignment of ministerial programs to national policies, irrespective of who is a political leader in that ministry. This helps in a sense that you do not actually see ministries doing what they want to do just because they have maybe a minister who is belonging to a specific political party. So all departments or all ministries are supposed to engage in activities that are clearly aligned to our National Development Strategic Plan. And also another important thing about NSDP is that all the ministerial budgets, before they can be approved they have to show that they are linked to the same NSDP. So if there is no clear linkage, then that budget is not going to be approved. So in that way, it forces ministries to ensure that whatever they do is linked to what we want to go as a nation, not necessarily what the political leader in that particular ministry wants, but what we at national level wants to go, to ensure that there is coordination and also some form of synergy in whatever we do. And also another important factor about NSDP, which assisted us very much, is that the activities of ministries continue as planned, even during government change or cabinet reshuffle. So we don't find ourselves in a situation where it may be a new minister comes in, he wants to change everything, maybe to take a direction that he or she wants, but he has to follow what has already been planned by the ministry, because the budget is already been allocated to those activities. So that has been very much helpful for the senior government officials to ensure that the business of ministries continues as expected, and also that it is in line with the national priorities. So on the basis of the NSDP, ministries are expected to develop their own strategic plans, which take maybe 3 to 5 years. So that strategic plan has to be directly linked to NSDP. So on the basis of the strategic plans, they're supposed to prepare again their operational plans, clearly stipulating what they are going to focus on during that particular year. So the budget again is still allocated to those activities. This again is linked to our performance management system, where the ministers are supposed to sign their contracts with the Prime Minister, and also the PSs are supposed to sign their performance contracts with their ministers, and the directors also sign performance contracts with the PSs, and the whole process cascades down. So those activities that appear in the contracts are again supposed to come directly from the NSDP, from the strategic plan of the ministry, and from the operational plans. So those ones have been very, very
I think you are muted. Kulsam, could you check?
It seems that we may have lost her. Yeah, I think we've lost her connectivity.
Yeah. Oh yeah, she's disappeared. That's a pity. Let us see now whether she's connecting. Okay, it seems she's struggling. At least she will still be with us to handle the questions, and she can use that opportunity to wind up. Maybe in the interest of time, we can move on to the next presentation, which is Zambia. Dr. Samuel Senkala from the National Institute of Public Administration, NIPA, in Zambia. That's a pity about Lesotho, but we will keep checking her and connect and reconnecting if possible.
Hello, good morning. Hello,
Morning,
Dr.
morning.
Kaunda, are you able? Do you hear me?
Morning, Dr. Sinkala. You may continue. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe just for starters, I'm not Dr. Sinkala. I'm Samuel Sakala, Mr. Sakala. I'm Director for Management Studies Division at the National Institute of Public Administration, NIPA, in Zambia. And my presentation or my contribution will basically dwell on the role of the professional bureaucracies. First of all, I would like to mention that in Zambia, we haven't had coalition or government of national unity per se since 1964, when we obtained our independence, political independence from the British. However, over the years, in the last 60 years, we've seen a number of political parties coming together to form some kind of coalitions in order to wrestle political power from the ruling party at the time. For example, in 1991, the movement for multi-party democracy came into existence due to a number of issues that they wanted to do. And one of the major objectives was basically to wrestle power from the first Republican president, Kenneth Kaunda. And at that time, we had a one-party state, meaning that only one political party was allowable under the constitution that existed between 1972 and 1991. And so when this movement for multi-party democracy came into being, they brought about a number of expertise and people, various political or diverse political interests together. And their main objective was to oust Kaunda from power. And that happened in 1991. However, after that, we began to see a fragmentation of a lot of political parties coming or breaking away from the movement of multi-party democracy. And one of the major issues that led to that was the ideological differences and also issues that had to do with power sharing and political appointments into government positions and all these kind of things. And so over the years, each time we have had elections, national elections, we've seen coalitions of political parties coming together to support maybe one political party, and so that they can usher in a certain individual. However, that has not been sustainable or has not stood those kind of coalitions because of what I've already mentioned, to say they have had these differences ideologically, and the fact that the agreement was not firmly formed at the time of coming together. It has been kind of loose in terms of what exactly is the objective, what exactly is the goal that we want to do. And so even in the last elections that we had in 2021, where we saw the current leadership being ushered in, there was a number of political parties that came together and formed this coalition. And we see that 2.5 years down the road, that coalition has kind of fragmented, has kind of fallen apart, where some members of that coalition have opted to go on their own and form their own political parties. Others have been incorporated into government, and they have been appointed to some ministerial positions and other government positions. So my contribution will basically look at the role of professional bureaucracies in the coalition, and what we have seen from end as Zambia is that one of the issues that we need to look at is the policy implementation and coordination. This is a critical role that professional bureaucracies or professionals in the bureaucracy play, because we know that for civil servants, their main role is to implement government policy and to coordinate those policies so that government can be seen to be heading in one direction. But in an arrangement that is of national unity or of a coalition nature, we see that even these particular civil servants do have a bias in terms of alignment to those particular individual political parties and ideologies and sentiments. And this policy implementation becomes an issue when it is not coordinated very well. In the second instance, we look at expertise and technical advice. Again, this is a critical role that the civil servants or the public servants play in making sure that the government functions and delivers on its promises, as well as alleviating or increasing or enhancing service delivery. And so, again, we have seen from our experience that a number of civil servants or public servants that have been appointed to certain critical government positions have been those that have been aligned to a certain political belief. And in some instances, these particular people that are being appointed are not really experts in particular areas. And this hinders the technical aspects of how they can advise government on certain policies that government should embark on or come up with in order to increase or enhance service delivery. The third is issues of neutrality and impartiality. Here again, political appeasements come in, where we see a lot of alignment with a particular political regime of these particular civil servants or public servants. And for the professional bureaucracy, neutrality and impartiality is cardinal for them to deliver, for them to work effectively, for them to be above party politics. But what we see from our end is that there is a very thin line between being a professional and being a political cadre, so to say, where we see people compromising their professionalism in order to maintain certain positions. They have to be politically aligned, so to say. Then we are talking about also capacity building and institutional strengthening. It is, again, cardinal for professional bureaucracies to enhance capacity building. Once we do this in the civil service, in the public service, it means that at that point, we'll be able now to have a system that will work effectively, regardless of the changes in the political establishments, whether it is politics in the political party or national politics. It doesn't matter. because at that point we would have built capacity and institutional strengthening within our system, which will be able to stand any changes that might happen with the coalition agreements or with the government of national unity. And even when we have change in political power, it won't matter. But in most of these cases, we have a situation where the moment a new political party comes into office, they do what I would term a purging process, where they do the cleansing of all those that may not be aligned to their political aspirations. And then finally, we are talking about issues of accountability and transparency. I think it is indeed, again, a feature of professional bureaucracies to be accountable and transparency in all they do, meaning that once it comes to making decisions, once it comes to implementing government policy, bureaucracies should be above reproach in terms of accountability, in terms of being responsible, in terms of being answerable for their actions. And this can only happen if there is an aspect of transparency in the manner that actions or decisions are taken. And so we see that from our end, this also it is an aspect that comes in to kind of hinder the effectiveness of government in terms of service delivery, in terms of policy making and all that. So basically, this is my short contribution to the discussion at hand. Thank you very much. Hello, Dr. Kaunda.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's Mr. Sam Sakala from Zambia. Thank you. Input is most appreciated. And I see, I think she connected and also lost the connection again from Lesotho. But let us now open up.
No, I'm back.
Oh, you are back?
Yes.
You are back. Okay, do you wish to quickly wrap up and then we'll go to questions?
Yes.
Okay.
I wanted to apologize for that. I just want to maybe talk about the role of, after talking about NSDP and those guiding documents, the role of training and development, where, again, it is very critical that during this time, we ensure that training of public officers goes as expected, and also induction to ensure professionalism and also improve service delivery, which is the business of government. So we have been able to induct the new administration, the past coalition, we're able to provide them with induction, and also the current one, where we're basically introducing them to the business of government so that they have appreciation of government structure, the laws and regulations governing public service, and the do's and don'ts, and what is expected of them in terms of conduct so that they're able to undertake their duties very well. And also training on the political and administrative interface, which can be quite challenging, because you find that sometimes the roles are not clearly understood, particularly between the ministers and the administration. So it is important that they really understand that as ministers, their role is basically to provide political direction, while the execution and implementation is basically the role of professionals. So you find that sometimes, because they are very excited and they want to see things going, they tend to find themselves being implementers themselves, and that creates friction. So we have been emphasizing that role so that they clearly understand their role. I think another important factor is the role of oversight institutions, the likes of the Public Service Commission, Office of Auditor General, the Ombudsman, and the like, that even though you find that the heads of those institutions are normally affected during government changes, but the professionals like the Public Service Secretary, the Deputy Auditor Generals, you find that they still ensure that government business operates as expected. And also on the issue of the so on the issue again, what as maybe I'm about to conclude, just to show the role that was played by the Minister of the Public Service and Finance during this period. Because of the coalition governments, we had a situation where we had many ministers where the cabinet was ballooned, which contributed highly to a high wage bill. So the current coalition government decided to make a decision to cut the size of the cabinet from 27 to 14. So that means quite a number of big ministries were meshed. We had a situation where Minister of Home Affairs, local government, and police were merged into one ministry to ensure that we have a smaller size of cabinet. And then the Minister of the Public Service was supposed to ensure that that process went on smoothly. So there was quite a lot of work that was supposed to be undertaken, like moving officers from certain ministries to other ministries, to ensuring that we have the new codes for the ministries, particularly for the budget and payroll, to ensure that officers are still paid timeously. But when we're still busy with that process, then there was a vote of no confidence scare, which resulted in having another political party joining coalition. And that meant we had to demerge some ministries which had already been meshed in order to accommodate the new political parties. Because when new political parties join, they have to be compensated somehow. So in most cases, you'll find that it's with government ministries. So that means that you'll find that when you are busy with another exercise, you'll find that quickly you have to change again because of a demand that can just come anytime. And that means we have to be very swift in terms of making decisions as the senior government officials, and you have to be agile in order to maybe prevent serious consequences that may arise. So as to conclude, maybe it's just a matter of showing that although coalition governments do come up with maybe quite a number of challenges, but it's a change that we have to embrace and accept as our new normal. So as the professional civil servants, it is our responsibility to ensure that the business of government moves as expected, so that service delivery is improved and the economy of our countries improve as expected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Let us now look at the questions, comments. Dr. Salim Latif, you will assist me with that part.
Thank you very much, Program Director. There are over 700 people in the room, so it's rather difficult to keep up with the questions. They are coming in more. Many of the questions have been responded to by some of our panelists in the answer tab, so people are welcome to look at it, and hopefully we'll allocate a little bit of time towards the end to respond to some of the questions. Some of them are very specific and they have been responded to. There are a lot of questions around trust, how to build trust at the political level, the mechanisms of building trust. There was a direct question to Mr. Finlay around how to build trust at the political level, but there are also questions around building trust between the administrators and the political level and the importance of that, and how to sustain a culture of motivation amongst public servants. We are incidentally joined also by a former premier and a senior public servant, Professor Job Mukoro, who has quite a bit of experience because he was both on the political side and the administrative side, and he raised the issue of how to sustain a culture of performance. The other questions were around the legalities of coalition arrangements and what legal mechanisms can be put in place in order to govern those arrangements and what has been the experience in different countries. I know that Jan has been responding to some of the questions around differences in policy and how does one reconcile them. For example, one of the questions was raised around the difference between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance around the issue of Israel. There were a lot of questions around public servants, the security of their work, and how do they actually stand up to the world in terms of evidence so that their professionalism is appreciated and that there is more sustained engagement around their location within the system of delivery. Quite a few people also raised questions about service delivery, how within this context of change is the momentum around service delivery sustained. So, Chairperson, those are broadly the parameters of the questions that are coming in. Our request, obviously, is to those panelists who are still coming to look at some of the questions so that we can build on these. I obviously can't get into every particular question at this point in time, and I'm hoping we can build on it. And some of them have been responded to already on the online platform. People are welcome to look at it. There have been a number of requests for the actual presentations. We'll see if we can try to upload them during the session, but just to mention the video is available on YouTube and can be viewed at a later stage, I believe. Thank you very much, Program Director. I think we must sustain the momentum unless panelists want to come in. I know some of them have to leave, but otherwise we can sustain the momentum and continue.
Okay. All right. I also propose we continue, especially since some of the questions are being responded to as we go along, and then we'll have interaction at the end. We are really grateful for our panelists from across beyond our borders because of the time frame, especially in Europe. We are happy that you were able to join us. The running message now as we move on to the next segment, which is the local experience segment, the message from the first presentation of Principal Prof. Ngaweni up to the last is the emphasis on a professional public service, professional public servants who serve the government of the day, which means that is what we are inculcating among South African public servants, serving the government of the day regardless of which political party or minister comes from, which is therefore an emphasis on the professionalization of the public service, which is what the NSG is focusing on and championing. We now move on to that segment, therefore, that talks to that. It's entitled New Unity and Coalition Arrangements and Learning from Local Experience. We have two panelists from this. Oh, I see Mr. Fergus Finlay is saying goodbye. Thank you very much. Goodbye. At least I noticed that you responded to some of the questions. Much appreciated. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Jan Cornelie also says goodbye. Everyone has to leave. Thank you. We appreciate your being here. Thank you very much. Thank you. So our panelists from Europe, I have to rush. They did indicate that they have other activities. Okay, our next segment, two presenters. The first being Dr. Imogen Mashazi, who is the municipal manager of the city of Ekurhuleni with more than 30 years experience in local government. The second one will be a person who wears many hats, Professor Mashuple Maserumule he's the Executive Dean of Humanities at Tshwane University of Technology, and is also a commissioner at the National Planning Commission, but he will be participating on behalf, representing the South African Association of Public Administration and Management, SAPAM. So I will start with Dr. Imogen Mashazi from Ekurhuleni. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Kaunda. Good morning, colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking, or before I do that, can I ask Carlson to flight my presentation? Thank you very much. Let me also thank the acting principal, Dr. Bochabelo Maja, for inviting me to be part of this webinar to share our experience as the city of Ekurhuleni on the phenomenon of coalition under the theme New Unity and Coalition Arrangements. Next page, please. Indeed, since the inception of the National School of Governance, in collaboration with institutions such as the Public Service Commission, the Public Affairs Research Institute, and the South African Association of Public Administration and Management have gone a long way in reminding us of the depth of the collective intellectual capabilities that exist in both the public sector and academia. This is much appreciated. The City of Ekurhuleni Coalition story started in the period 2016 to 2021. The experience of that time saw the former executive mayor, Mzwandile Masina, launching the book, Future Realities of Coalition in South Africa, Reflection on Coalition Governments in Metros 2016-2021. The mayor summed up his reflection by stating a number of recommendations, at the hem of which was develop a clearly defined, well understood, and commonly accepted coalition agreement. The last local government elections took place in November 2021. There are 15 political parties represented in council. Since there is no political party with an outright majority, Ekurhuleni can be referred to as a hung municipality. Obviously, there are challenges and complexities in the city of Ekurhuleni political governance structure. Currently, there's no coalition framework to support political arrangement or to support a management of governance. This potentially interferes with administrative stability and ultimately service delivery. There are a lot of political conflicts at mayoral committee, of which obviously impact negatively on the administration. At some point, we did not have the executive to run with our IDP, integrated development plans, that are supposed to be passed every 5 years for communities to actually raise their issues in terms of service delivery. Example of lack of political management of governance led to two politically motivated court cases against the city and 3 different mayors being appointed in a period of 3 years, out of which we are expected to have a 5-year term. Stability of the multi-party coalition in Ekurhuleni is often affected by political, provincial, and national dynamics, which themselves are unstable. There are no terms of reference to regulate the political management team, which is compromised of respective office bearers. It is important for administrators to have such a framework so that we can work within that framework as professionals. Then I'm going to turn into opportunities associated with professionalism in a coalition at the city of Ekurhuleni, because as professionals, we are expected to be apolitical and just implement the mandate of the government of the day. Political leadership heavily rely on the administrative leadership to achieve targets when there is no stability. Less contestation from the political leadership against the administration due to the nature of the hung state of the municipality. There is increased advocacy from different stakeholders to enforce compliance due to political contestation. Institutions like your Auditor General of South Africa. There was also promotion of a diverse range of ideas and perspectives on how to take the city forward. Next slide, please. Let's look at the impact on the results. The city was able to achieve 3 consecutive clean audits and unqualified audit opinions due to the professionalism that has been practiced throughout the instability that has been brought about by the coalition government. The city received 4 awards of excellence governance from South African Local Government Association. The city was also able to comply with the IDP and budget approval, albeit robust interaction and media inquiries and media statements that were made by politicians from different political parties in council. So I'm turning now to recommendation. I'm trying to manage time. Number 1, we need to tighten the internal controls as professionals to ensure that we continue to adhere to governance. We need to ensure that we prevent the unauthorized, irregular, fruitless, and wasteful expenditure without succumbing to any political pressure, because politicians have their own views in terms of on how the budget should be implemented. We need to adhere to the regulations like your MFMA, Structures Act, and other relevant legislation that govern local government. We need to strengthen and effectively implement consequence management where there is no performance. And we need to ensure that there's vigilant management of performance information within the administration. We need to monitor targets and priorities as outlined in the IDP and also our service delivery implementation business plan that we implement on an annual basis based on the service delivery mandate from our communities. We need to ensure that there is also retention of current management to ensure continuity, as all professionals are expected to be non-political. If we change administrators as and when we have new mayor, it becomes a problem, or new executive, it becomes a problem in the sense that local government is very complex. You need people who are experienced, who can continue with services. In the case of the government of national unity, it is crucial that government's priorities should be based on general population needs and not on party political mandate. This must be monitored and oversighted through the government of national unity framework and not on individual ministry. Hence, I was stressing the issue of retention of senior administrators, because they've been there, they've been appointed in terms of their qualifications, not on party political partisans. Conclusion, in terms of my conclusion, I'm advising that there must be a developed joint political governance framework to manage the coalition, collaborative governments, or government of national unity. There need to be a compliance also, assurance of compliance with rules and regulations without succumbing to any political pressure, because in South Africa, fortunately, we are not appointed according to party line. We are appointed in terms of our qualification. We need to advance professionalism in managing politics and avoid party political partisanship amongst management as senior leaders. In the case of the city of Ekurhuleni, notwithstanding the complexities of coalitions, the city has been able to be stable as a result of efficient governance, and professionalism that we have displayed throughout the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that experience from the coalface, from Eguruleni, which has gone through coalitions for a long time. And I'm happy you raised the issue of a legal framework to manage coalitions. As we all know, the Municipal Structures, Local Government Municipal Structures Act is being amended to include components. The bill includes components on managing coalitions, managing with suggestions such as proposals such as that you cannot demand a vote of no confidence against a mayor until they have at least served 1 year. That's part of promoting stable coalitions. So it's interesting that you raised that. And then there are also questions here, I think from David Jansen again about that the statement of intent is not law. Should there be an amendment of the Constitution, or should there be a legal framework to manage coalitions from provincial and national government? There are other questions from communicators led by their DG, the acting DG, Government Communication and Information System, Ms. Nomonde Mnuko, who wants to know how. So panelists, this is for you when you respond later. How did you ensure coherent communication? One voice, no contradictions, both at government and by individual political parties. How do you ensure one voice, even though there are many mouths? One voice, although there are many people communicating, one coherent government message. Let us look at that as we think about it. And then there's also a question on how the political and administrative relationship is managed to ensure optimum performance of the departments. And I'm raising it because I know it's a pet subject of the next panelist, Professor Mashupe Maserumule, the Executive Dean of Humanities at Tshwane, who is also here on behalf of SAPAM, the South African Association of Public Administration and Management. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much, Doc, and good morning to all colleagues on the line. New unity and coalition arrangements, learning from local experience. I must say that I as well got tempted to, pick up certain important insights from international experience, but the presentation is largely local. The first point that I need to make, it's actually a quote from one experts on matters of the electoral system, Dennis Kadima. He makes a very important point. He says that, and I quote, "The nature and character of the country's electoral system predetermines the neutral propensity of party to opt for coalitions," close quote. That is critically important, because the point that Dennis is making is that as a country, because of our electoral system, we have long been destined to the situation that we find ourselves in now. You'll recall that at the time when we were talking about how to fashion our constitutional system, we particularly when we're talking about our electoral system, a key concept at that particular point in time centered around the notion of inclusive polity. And the late Professor Katral Assmann contributed a very powerful paper, much about it, subsequently became part of our electoral system. So what we are seeing in the country now, it has always been coming. There's nothing new. And I'm quite excited that if you listen to all those international experiences, we are not exception in terms of trying to contend with some of the challenges that we're currently contending with. But I am glad that this morning we are all focused on how can we make coalition work. In other words, we need to accept the fact that coalition are inevitable consequences of democracy. We can't shy away from coalitions. So the question that we need to answer is, how do we make them work? And for the purpose of the context in which we currently find ourselves now, we are asking this question, at least with the benefit of insight, in terms of what had happened, particularly in the local sphere of government. And I'm glad that my colleague shared the experiences in Ekurhuleni. It was one of the best run coalitions. And I'm glad that the former mayor documented the experience of that municipality. It is important to always document certain, lessons from our own. It's critically important. But the point that I want to make, as it relates to our own experience, as we contend with issues of coalition, particularly learning from our own experience insofar as our local government coalition arrangements are concerned, I just want to make a distinction between coalition that emerged around 2000 and coalition that emerged in 2016. Those that emerged around 2000 were not many, largely in the Western Cape and the West. Those that emerged largely in 2016, particularly in our metro, have been a challenge. They were fraught with a myriad of challenges, right? And I'm glad that we made an effort in terms of trying to understand exactly what makes this subsequent set of coalition in our local sphere of government not work. What came out very clear was a lack of legally binding agreements, right? Secondly, was the fact that in many instances, our sets of coalitions, particularly from 2016, were coupled together for expediency. We did not really see much of common program as a basis of coalition. And largely also, much of the political intonation was more about working together to get rid of another party. And we have seen many parties that were part of the 2016 sets of, from 2016 sets of local coalitions, conflicting party interests. And more disturbingly, it was this phenomena of patronage seeking, which often led to instances where politicians meddled with the administration, where municipal managers got fired, instances where attempts to influence tenders were evident. So this is what actually came from subsequent coalition from 2016. And they gave us great lessons, right? They gave us great lessons. The first important lessons that we need to internalize as we try to fashion coalition at the national government, the first important thing that ought to be done is to accept the fact that coalitions are the inevitable consequences of our democracy. In other words, we should not frown upon them, but make them work. I think that's the point that I made earlier. In other words, coalitions are here to stay as part of our political system, as is the case in many countries in Europe, in Asia, Scandinavia, and other African countries. So they are part of us. We just have to make sure that we live with that reality and, more importantly, make them work. And also, if we accept that coalitions are the inevitable consequences of our democracy, that will be a very important step in creating what you call a coalition culture, which can only take root if parties create platforms for engagement. And I must also reiterate a very important lesson that emerged from Germany. The Germans will tell you, one German politician said something very profound. And he said that the key to the success of coalition is to talk, and talk to each other. In other words, talks about talks. And fortunately, we are familiar with that concept in our system. Talks about talks. Those that were there during those times will understand what I'm talking about. And also facts about coalitions, like as we've been listening to our colleagues from Europe and elsewhere in the world and also from the continent. Coalitions are not easy to create. That's a fact. So it takes patience. And another important fact about coalition is that in countries where they endured, differences among coalition partners are understood and accepted as an inherent part of coalition politics. In other words, differences are managed in a way that keep coalition afloat, not to destroy them. And that is another important, that's the fact about coalition. So, new unity and coalition arrangement. If you look at our approach now, we went back to the Mandela government of national unity lesson. Of course, as Dr. Lakela Kawinda indicated, what we have now, the version of the government of national unity now, is not the same version of Mandela's government of national unity, because the contexts are different. However, there is one important lesson which I think we picked up from Nelson Mandela's government of national unity lesson. And that was that issue that I talked about earlier on of inclusive polity, right? Because when you look at the statement of intent, which was issued, right? The key message which runs through that statement of intent, and also the political invitation of other parties to come on board to form the government of national unity. The critical element, the critical message there is that of inclusive polity, right? And what is important is that you could see that there is a sense that there is a semblance of acceptance of the fact that differences amongst coalition partners are an inherent part of coalition politics, right? And also, the government of national unity model compels political parties to rethink their politics imaginatively in a way that transcends their partisan disposition and embraces the pursuit of the public good. And that is critically important. In other words, as we move into coalition politics, it becomes critically important for political parties to start to reimagine their politics. And at the center of that reimagination ought to be the notion of public good. So all what I'm trying to say is that the government of national unity concept is a good start. It's a good start, and it clearly shows that we have learned certain lessons from our own local government arrangements, and we don't really want to repeat the same that we made at the local government level. And maybe just to restate this important point, it must always be at the back of mind that when one do the analysis, you realize that a key reason for unstable coalition is fragmentation of politics. the proliferation of smaller parties, right? And a strange phenomenon is that, particularly in the local sphere of government, a strange phenomenon has always been that when coalitions were coupled together, key political executive positions, such as that of a mayor, went to smaller parties, particularly in your metro. And the major parties used their numbers to influence policy decisions by the executive authority from smaller parties. And still, when choices prove faulty, major parties pulling the string, eschew accountability, while smaller party takes a rep. And this, I think, distorts the essence of representative democracy. And we need to be careful of that. Why I am emphasizing this point, it will come clear later. But maybe let me just quickly talk more about making a coalition work. I will try to be as quick as possible. Firstly, and this is a point that has already been made, we need a legislative framework for the coalition. But however, I need to quickly hasten to add that if you look at countries where coalitions succeeded, the main reason it is not necessarily because there is a legislative framework for that. It's political maturity. So as much as we put emphasis on legislative framework, we should at the same time also emphasize the fact that legislative framework is not a panacea. What is critically important is political maturity for coalition to work. Be that as it may, however, I just want to also quickly emphasize that such legislative framework should actually emphasize that major party must lead coalitions. And that is the point that I was actually trying to make earlier. And also, at some point, given our reality, whether we like it or not, we have to confront the question of electoral threshold, right? We need to confront the question of electoral threshold. In other words, should the electoral threshold for allocating seats in the legislature and municipality not be up to eliminate the proliferation of the smaller parties? We need to talk about that. In Cape Town, this was the bone of contention when we were talking about a framework for coalition, right? And if you go to Denmark, Denmark has a threshold of 2%, which translates into a minimum of 4 seats in parliament. And in our case, our electoral system is so generous, you know? So we need to talk about that at some point. And also, coalition agreement. I cannot emphasize this point more. It is critically important. I fully agree with the question that was raised earlier about the fact that statement of intent is not necessarily your coalition agreement, right? So there is more that ought to be done insofar as forging agreement for coalition politics, And also, maybe just to talk more about this coalition agreement, these agreements are common in almost all countries with a long and rich history of coalition politics. They laid out the terms of coalition arrangement, and research indicates that there is a clear link between stable coalitions and coalition agreements, and therefore coalition agreements are critically important. And secondly, coalitions agreement ought to be made public, and that is critically important to build public trust, particularly in the context where all surveys and opinion polls tend to indicate that people are largely disengaging from electoral politics, and also they are disengaging, they are starting to show a sense of distrust on public institutions. If you go to countries like Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Britain, and Kenya, coalition agreements are actually made public. In some instances, in some other countries, coalition agreements are legally binding. And also, coalition agreements should lay a foundation for the formulation of a common program, and the process for this should be transparent. And that obviously underscores the point that was made by my colleague earlier on. And coalition formation needs more time. However, the legal framework needs to specify what more time means. Currently, I think parties are given 14 days after the elections to constitute the legislature. However, in terms of constituting government, I don't really think that we do have a time limit. However, the time limit that we talk about should not really go to an extent of more than 500 days like the Belgium. And also, more importantly, we need to professionalize the public service. In other words, the public service needs to be professionalized to have the capacity to absorb the challenging nature of coalition politics. And to that extent, we need to leverage on the framework for the professionalization of the public sector, which, as colleagues indicated earlier on, was approved in 2022. And fortunately, also, there are currently legislative amendments to write various parts of the framework into law, and that also is a very important development towards the professionalization of the public service. And also in the local debates, there is a suggestion that coalition partners must analyze each other's strengths relative to certain portfolio and use the outcome of that exercise as a basis for allocating portfolios. The approach in managing motion of no confidence in parliament and legislature must not simply be based on how many times they are tabled, but also their substance. And I'm glad that the law is actually being changed insofar as that is concerned to manage, this motion of no confidence phenomena. And coalitions should not be coupled together for expediency, but they should serve the public interest. In other ways, coalitions parties should coalesce over issues, not just power. The Danish experience could probably come in handy here, where they even have this thing of legislative coalition. That is, parties coalescing around a particular legislative pursuit. Political coalition must build relations with various sectors of society, including the community in general, and also coalition must be built in a way that institutionalizes accountability and transparency, and also we need to institutionalize dispute resolution mechanisms. And perhaps moving towards the conclusion, again, going back to Dennis. Dennis make a very important point, which I want to also conclude with. He says that theories of party coalition are essentially based on the experiences of continental Western Europe and do not account sufficiently in their theorization of social privilege-related facts. Kadima's key point is that about building sustainable coalition in South Africa. Europe has a long history of coalition politics from which to draw lessons. Outside experiences, however, should be tested against our own situational peculiarities. Less effort to fashion strategic policy intervention become contextless exercises lacking in relevance. I am sure that I'm still within your time, Dr. Lakela Kaunta, but thank you so much. This is what I could, at least for now, contribute to the debate about this important issue that you posed to us. But I think now with all the information that we have, we are ready as a country to move forward, put together a coherent legislative framework for coalition. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for the input. And panelists, please continue looking at the Q&A and respond to the questions there. There's a lot of questions being posed. I notice now as we move towards the next session, which is the professionalism, I saw a question in the chat which says why are we talking about the professionalization of the public service? Because the public service has always been professional. I know there's always that view. Why are you saying we are unprofessional? Indeed, the fact that we had no cabinet between the 19th of June and the 3rd of July, and the president was able to run the country assisted by DGs and the professional public service, it says a lot about the professionalism of the South African public service. So public servants in the group, you can clap for yourselves. However, as we move on, the professionalization, I would advise colleagues to look at the framework for the professionalization of the public service, which was adopted by Cabinet in October 2022. There's also a directive on the professionalization, Volume 1, signed by the Minister for the issued by the Minister for the Public Service and Administration, which is part of implementing the framework. Basically, it's about further entrenching professionalism in the public service. For example, in the past, you could apply, become a director, join the senior management of the public service without actually doing anything. You just apply and you're appointed. Now we know we have to do Nugela. We have to do a course which tests your ability for strategic planning, strategic thinking, understanding how the public service works. So, thank you. Principal has just shared the professionalization framework. You'll be able to see it. So that is part of ensuring that someone who becomes a senior manager, a director up to DG, coming from the private sector within the public service, understands the ethics, understands what is required of them, ethically, strategically, technically. That Nugela is now also being transferred to the MMS, your deputy directors, etc. level. So that is part of further professionalizing. We now, on that professionalism note, we'll be happy to have now Professor Mbongiseni Buthelezi, the Executive Director of PARI, the Public Affairs Research Institute, who will talk to us on the topic of professionalism in the context of coalitions and the government of national unity. Before I see Dr. Imogen, I think you said you'll be leaving. Please, before you go, handle that question, a number of questions on communication. How are you managing communication at Ekurhuleni? Also, Lesotho, lessons from you. How do you ensure that the harmonization, making sure that there's one government message, there's one GNU speaking, and not different political parties sharing their messages? Thanks. Over to you, Prof. Mbongiseni Buthelezi.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, colleagues, for your presence in this webinar. So it was indicated earlier that most of the speakers are either people who've been public servants or academics who studied in the public service. So let me confess that I've never been a public servant, but I am going to speak both as somebody who works in an institute that studies the public service as it actually exists and functions, towards making very practical recommendations for how we can deal with some of the problems that we see. But also, I'm going to speak as a citizen of South Africa, which is where I'm going to start. So let me begin with context, and I think it's worth stating some of these things, I think, quite frankly, for ourselves here. We are having this conversation in a context where South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, where poverty, inequality, unemployment, hunger, and misery are pretty much common cause in South Africa. We're also in a context where I think we can agree that service standards are uneven and that the public is really, I think, fed up with poor service provision in the country. Here we can talk about our water infrastructure here in Johannesburg, where I live, that's falling apart. We can talk about roads. We can talk about sewage that I had to drive through on my way to the office this morning. And this experience, of course, repeats itself in many places across the country. We're also talking in a context where corruption in some ways has become rampant and has been institutionalized. And let's also remember that we're talking in a context where there's been depoliticization of the public service, where the line between public service and political office has in many ways not been as firm as it needs to be and has been transgressed continuously. And so I think coalitions, as we see them now, are in part a result of the frustration of the electorate in South Africa. So as a citizen, and as many other citizens, I think, have been saying on public platforms, we just want to live in a country where things work, where what we've seen, where some politicians, some business people, some civil servants need to just stop stealing as much as they've been doing and flaunting that in our faces. So I think that's the context in which we're talking about coalitions and what has happened with coalitions, how we've found ourselves where we are today. Now, let me go at this slightly differently. I've had new thoughts to what I've prepared as I've listened to other people. And I'm going to pin what I'm going to say for the next few minutes on a quote I want to start with from Charles Dickens, of all people. This is to betray my training as a literary scholar. In his 1859 novel, A Tale of Two Cities, talking about 1775, the novel opens with these lines. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness, it was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. I think we can say this about two moments that I just want to focus on in South Africa. Rather than, and colleagues like Professor Maserumule have talked about the slightly longer history of South Africa. I want to just focus on the moment just before elections and on the current moment where we now have a GNU it seems there's consensus on. So the moment before the elections was the worst of times in some ways. Worst of times, if we look historically, in that what we were seeing was some of the legislation that's been referred to by colleagues being rushed through Parliament in an attempt to get it through before the rise of Parliament, of the Sixth Parliament. This is not just a legislation, of course, on professionalizing the public service, but there are other pieces of legislation. Some of those historical pieces of legislation that have been rushed through Parliament just before elections have been pretty terrible. They are rushed through knowing full well that they're going to be challenged, sometimes in court after elections and overturned. And this has been the case with many land laws in South Africa for the last 20 years. They are cynically passed to win votes in many instances. And one of those pieces of legislation that there was an attempt to push through Parliament was the Public Procurement Bill in the last Parliament. It was passed and it's now awaiting the president's signature. So it was the worst of times in that sense when we think about the historical experience of South Africa in the last 30 years with legislation. But in the context of this conversation, I think it was the best of times. There were good public sector reforms deriving, I think, from the professionalization framework that the principal has shared in the comments. There were good pieces of public sector reform of legislation on public sector reform before the Sixth Parliament that I think we would have been better off had they been passed. The one piece of legislation I want to just talk about briefly is, of course, the Public Service Amendment Bill, which was passed by the National Assembly, but it didn't make it through the National Council of Provinces in time before the end of the term of the Sixth Parliament. At this point, of course, our hope is that in the new Parliament, this piece of legislation is going to be revived and it's going to go through, even though it doesn't fix all of the problems that we are seeing, especially when it comes to political overreach into the administration. And that's partly, I think, to what Dr. Kaunda was talking about earlier, in terms of the question being asked, professionalization, further professionalization, to deal with that political administrative interface and the overreach of politicians into the administration. The other bill, of course, that also I think we would have been better off if it had been passed is the Public Service Commission Bill, which has also lapsed. The bill seeks primarily to enhance the conditions for the impartiality and the independence of the Public Service Commission, giving the Public Service Commission a dedicated secretariat with a budget vote directly by Parliament, instead of what we currently see, where the Office of the Public Service Commission is a unit of the DPSA. It also seeks to strengthen the Commission in playing its constitutionally mandated role in relation to local government and public entities. And I think, again, if this can get through Parliament, I think we would be the better for it in South Africa. So I think that was the moment before the elections. Let me then quickly come to the current moment after the elections, after the GNU. So it's the best of times, I think, because the legislation that I've just touched on can and I think should be revived, and it can still be passed. There's a good chance that with a government of national unity, with a focus, a renewed focus on accountability, where there's political plurality, even at the level of the executive, that political plurality might yield a desire to do something about professionalization, to build a professional public service. And again, I must say, to the question that Dr. Kaunda had pulled up from the comments, we've heard over and over again the president, in the context of climate change, for example, decrying the lack of capability in the state. And that lack of capability he has put down to, and we've seen from the Zondo Commission, that is a result of the hollowing out of the state over many, many years, where good civil servants left and went and worked in the private sector and in other places. So to rebuild the state, to rebuild the public service as an employer that people can choose, instead of going to choose out of university, for example, to go and work in the public service. There's some rebuilding of the public service necessary. And these pieces of legislation, I think, can take us some way towards achieving that. So that legislation can still be revived and can still pass. And that, I think, is the best of times in this moment, where we can use the energies, the renewed vigor, the renewed focus in the government of national unity, the renewed attempts to be accountable to the public that is fed up, as I spoke about earlier, to try and get good legislation passed that's going to take us forward, with actually not only a focus on the present moment, but with us focusing on the long-term future of South Africa, on making amendments to legislation that are going to take us into the long-term future, and that can be sustainable in building the kind of public service that we want to see. But also, as much as it is the best of times, it is also the worst of times. The questions that arise in this moment is, will this GNU get consensus on reforms that are in progress and need to be revived and seen through? That is an open question we don't yet know, and this will come into view as things unfold. But as I move towards a close, let me also remind us of, I think, what has been touched upon by colleagues about the role of public servants in a moment like this. As Dr. Kaunda and other colleagues have pointed out, it is the role of public servants to hold the country together in moments of transition. And here I recall an earlier moment of transition when President Thabo Mbeki stepped down, President Motlanthe came into power, and then there was a transition of power to President Jacob Zuma. And I'm reminded of Reverend Frank Chikane's book, 8 Days in September, where it was the public servants that really held the country together through those heady transition moments, transition moments, actually, 2 of them. But we've also heard from earlier speakers this morning about the role of public servants to push back against political office bearers and overreaching. We heard in the case of Belgium how that is something that can be done. We heard in Maxine's talk earlier, talking about how one of the ways in which public servants have done this in Belgium is through procrastination, not responding immediately to instructions from political office bearers. And I'm saying this in a South African context, of course, where we have a problem that we've normalized what it means, what it looks like to deliver in the lead up to elections. There's always a rush, and I've spent a bit of time in KwaZulu-Natal just before the elections this year, a rush to have imbizos, to have these delivery forums, to have things launched just before the elections as a way of drumming up political support, which is not the way that things should be happening. This is partly, I think, due to the fusion of political office and would-be professionals It's part of that overreach of politicians, which means that people are appointed into what should be professional offices through using, I think, political means, through using people's positions in political parties, so that there is a kind of fusion in some instances and not a clear delineation of where political office ends and professional office begins. So you find that people who are supposed to be professionals are running around actually activists of political parties, doing that service delivery as a way of drumming up political support for their own political parties. This is one of the things that we need to get out of our system. And again, some of this legislation that we need to get passed will take us some way in that direction. But we also see in South Africa, one of the things that we've normalized is that in many public offices, work simply stops in the lead up to elections. When public servants start going out to campaign for political parties, and we see this, I've been talking to people who work in various capacities across departments across the country as part of the research that we do. In many places, we couldn't even find somebody to talk to because public servants are out campaigning for political parties. This is the poor management of the political administrative interface that we've normalized in South Africa. The regular work of the state must go on even if there's an election, even if there are negotiations for a GNU. We still need clean water coming out of our taps. We still need medicines to be restocked in public hospitals, and we need floods responded to when they occur. The best of times that I'm talking about is that what we are seeing in the GNU is that the incentive structure might be changing for both political office bearers, but also for public servants. For example, ministers and senior civil servants may no longer be comrades from the same political movement. And hence, what we might be seeing is that accountability mechanisms that are already in the rules in many instances, but they've simply been ignored for the last 20 odd years, might begin to actually work. And so I have hope that the moment we're in will begin to chart a way forward that will take us into a long-range future where we actually can get South Africa to work. And I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you there, Prof. Mbongiseni Telezi. And in fact, it's so good that you've raised those points because the next person who's going to follow you is someone who is responsible for the norms and standards and oversight and making sure the public service does what it's supposed to do, is ethical, professional, all the recruitment practices, etc., are followed to the T. And that is none other than Professor Somadoda Figeni, who is the chairperson of the Public Service Commission. Over to you, Prof.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lakela Kaunda, and greetings to the leadership of NSG, fellow panelists, and all the people in attendance in this particular forum. I will just pick up on a few things, but before then, I think we should congratulate NSG and commend them for having risen to the level of being a thought leader in many respects, raising the profile of NSG, because this is a knowledge institution. Training must emanate from that knowledge. And what I think is a running thread as we speak of professionalism in the public service is the issue of comparison, lessons from global and local cases. But the context, especially your political and institutional context, matters the most. And as Professor Maseremola and other speakers were saying, if you have an electoral system as the proportional representative system that we have, especially the closed party list system, globally, it tended to produce coalitions. It was South Africa and Namibia which had remained as outliers in that space, which means with the current electoral system, we can just rest and be assured that coalitions are here to stay. Therefore, it's not a passing phase. It's something that we must prepare for and actually regulate so that we are able to navigate a predictable space. Of course, this will take a bit of time. I'll just pick up on a few things that I think may not have been emphasized or picked up in a strong manner within this context, and then highlight a few things that I think are relevant to this discussion. The first one, somewhere we have to reflect on the role of constitutional bodies, especially during these times of uncertainty and transition, precisely because they were crafted to have relative autonomy and insulation from political machinations. Whether it's the Public Protector or the Auditor General or the PSC, the Human Rights Commission, you name them, they do have some degree of insulation such that they can actually step in to defend the Constitution, to defend the law at the times of these uncertainties. Not so long ago, PSC found itself in that particular space. We had anticipated that during transition, signals were there that were leading to coalition. Hence, we issued that guide for executive authorities as well as heads of departments or DGs on how to navigate this space, because public sector is one of the most regulated spaces. No career incident has a vacuum, to make sure that unlawful instructions would not take place. It was not long after that when the bargaining process, the leaking of letters came, and it became very clear that one of the parties was threatening to come up with its own DGs, remove others, and so forth, when PSC had to stand up because DGs on themselves couldn't stand up without being seen as defending themselves. And similarly, the Forum of Institutions Supporting Democracy. So in future, I think the role of these institutions and their autonomy becomes very much important when we say they should be asserted, because they will come handy during these times to protect the policies, to protect the constitutional provisions of what public sector and public service ought to be, and what professionalism and those constitutional values and principles ought to be. But there is another area that I think we are not spending enough time reflecting on: the political psychology of the public service and of coalition politics, including the rational choices and what informs those in the process of their interface. And that political psychology at a behavioral and psychological level, including the institutional culture and so forth, it's something that I think we need to invest more in that space, because it is not just the legislation, but it is the behavioral patterns as well as perceptions and misperceptions, trust and mistrust. It is in this realm that I actually think that even the training institutions, academic institutions, should invest more into the space of soft skills. How to deal with diversity, how to anticipate conflict situations, how to deal with trust and building of trust. Those are in the psychological realm. They are not sometimes written in any particular space. And that in itself, I think, is a space even social scientists and those studying the public sector have not spent much time, dealing with those particular areas. And in a toxic environment or in spaces of certain kinds of personalities, if you have this strong personality minister and a strong personality DG, and all of them are there to prove a point, you're almost certain that you will have a clash down the line. And that profiling of the behavioral patterns becomes very much important, not only for DGs, the DDGs, the chief directors, and so forth. So we may have to reflect on how we approach that particular space, because even the international practice and experiences that were spoken to, they were alluding to the fact that we had to learn the ropes along the way on how to deal with these particular situations. As Prof. Buthelezi was saying right now, the issues of even editing the language in a professional space. Here you used to say, hi, comrade. You used to say, hi, chief. You used to say, through the eye of the needle. You used to say progressive forces and so forth. And now you're going to deal with a minister from a different world of politics where such lexicon may signal something different. How do we deal with those particular spaces? And how do we deal with the issue of political culture and unlearning certain things that we've learned in order to relearn new things? The next point I want to raise, which I think it's something we've not reflected on. We may think that coalition politics might be bringing people from different political backgrounds, therefore tensions will be there. What if I say to you, when ANC in the early 2000s or mid-2000s and post-Polokwane, the factional politics within the ruling party actually presented a situation as complex as a coalition is, or even at times more toxic than the coalition politics. And there was a time when you had no less than 8 cabinet reshuffles. And most of the time, the politics of factions and the contestations within the ruling party and the instinct of mistrust and removing people who were in a position because you believe they are from the other faction and therefore aligned to the previous minister who was removed, and the staff in those offices was as brutal and probably might prove to have been more brutal, preparing people for this particular period, where you may find a person from another party more polite, more willing to accommodate than those who were from the same party but with different factional wars. And that in itself we have not actually applied ourselves in, because we say, oh, the situation might actually be bad. What if the opposite turns out to be? Because those leaders from different political parties are so anxious, they've never been in a government on the scale, and they do know that they might be moving into a hostile space. They might exercise a lot more caution and try to get more allies and more understanding than we may actually give them credit for, precisely because they know elections are around the corner for 2026, or the very coalition arrangement is precariously hanging on threads which are fragile. And therefore, they may try to reach out. They may try to say, I do not have the horns that you think I have. So that in itself, I think, might be a counterintuitive thing at a distance. But the reality is that that professionalism was gutted when factional battles and factional politics were actually coming in. I liked what the Belgian example, I think it was Jan, when he said the chief advisors of these political players from different political parties need to be given support and access to centers of excellence. There might be a need to target those people in the private offices, like your chief of staff, your advisors, and so forth, for a training, so that they are also taken into the same space of this professionalism and professionalization, and go beyond just looking at how their principal and the political party they are bringing, and something larger in terms of the agenda and the priorities of the 7th administration, but also the national interest, as it were. So a targeted approach to that effect, I think, becomes very much important. How do you deal with situations such as your study group, which were necessitated by the fact that you had a dominant party at a given time? Therefore, a party would want to have access prior to meetings and so forth. Now the situation is a little bit more complex, and an advice very specific to such situations become very much important. And ultimately, we should be looking at this political logic and political psychology and choices that bureaucrats and political role players pay, and define a new ethos along the line of professionalization framework and beyond as we navigate this particular space. I think I felt I needed to just reflect on some of those, but I end by saying, should we not be talking boldly, especially we constitutional bodies, about the need of a symmetrical professionalization of politics? Because it cannot be that you professionalize public service, but you do not professionalize politics, and the threshold and the entry into politics become so low. Look at the situation which was reported in the media in some instances where they said in some municipalities, some councillors were saying we would like to be taught to read and write, whatever the context might have been. And those people have to sit in committees and make decisions over technocrats, over engineers, water engineering, over civil engineering work, and sometimes in portfolio committees, over highly trained, professionalized persons. I do think that we need to have an equilibrium and an ecosystem of professionalization throughout society, but also professionalize our civil society so that we do have a higher level and sophisticated engagement about professionalism in all spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Somadoda Figeni, for that input, wrapping up and emphasizing professionalism. We have now come to the section where we must now have our panelists wrap up and respond to some of the questions that are raised there in the chat. Some have been responded to already, but when they give their winding up inputs, they will also deal with some of the issues raised, which I saw another question before I hand over to them, which was asking about whether there is a need for the GNU to look at a skills audit of the entire public service, skills audit of departments from TK, skills audit of departments in order to allay fears of incoming parties, etc. This is actually already happening. You would recall that in the SONA of last year, the president announced that the NSG would conduct a skills audit of infrastructure, a technical skills audit of infrastructure departments. As we speak, there's a work going on with the HSRC to that effect, with a number of frontline infrastructure departments, your transport, your water. The DPSA is also engaged is going to engage in a nationwide skills audit of the public service as per their mandates, the Department of Public Service and Administration. They are starting with a small pilot project, and the NSG is among the pilots. We are currently very busy with that, preparing for the modalities for that skills audit. So a skills audit is being done at a national level already. May I now ask our panelists to wrap up, summarizing some of the questions, looking at some of the issues raised in the chat, and any other inputs. Over to you. We can start with you. Let me see now on my list. Prof. Maserumule, you are first there on my list. Thanks.
Thanks, Doc, and thanks once more for all your questions, your comments. I just want to make a comment about, it's a comment about another comment which was made related to professionalization. Why do you professionalize? Because the public service has always been professionalized. I think we need to go deeper in terms of trying to understand what we mean by professionalization, right? Because there are many instances wherein people will tend to assume that professionalization is just a simply act of credentialism. I go to the university, I come back with as many degrees as possible, blah, 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 blah. It's not yet a professionalism. Our notion of professionalization should underscore the significance of institutionalizing what we call capability, competence. These are critically important issues. And when I talk about competence, I'm not just only talking about technical competence. I'm also talking about ethical competence. And perhaps if I can just talk about the latter, which, as I've always been emphasizing, that our approach in many instances in terms of trying to prepare a professionalized public service. There is another element in the education of a professional public servant that we are missing. And that is about character formation. For me, that is key. It is key because many a time we've seen so many of our public servants technically competent, but ethically bankrupt. We've seen them. It played itself out before the Zondo Commission. So when we talk about professionalization, we need to go deep in terms of trying to make sure that we fully appreciate the totality of the attributes that ought to make a model public servant that we need to drive the country's developmental agenda. Dr. Winter, I just wanted to make that point, but I could see that likely most of the points or rather questions that have been asked have been answered by my colleague, but I just wanted to make that point. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Dr. Imogen Mashazi Eburuleni.
Program director.
Has she left? Oh, okay. Oh, all right. Sorry. She still appears here on my list. Let us have Mr. Sakala, Zambia, your closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaunda. I'll take a peek on the aspects of professionalism that we've been discussing. And so I just want to give an experience from Zambia, what Zambia is doing right now. The National Institute of Public Administration has been charged with the mandate to train all public servants, retrain them in a lot of competences. And this is a mandate that is going back to the original goal of the National Institute of Public Administration when it was established in 1963. And what this is that we are going to have, we have designed a number of training programs targeting a whole range of public servants, from the ministers, cabinet ministers, all the way to the least public servant employee. And so in there we have, for instance, a module on public pre-deployment of public servants. This one is targeted for those that have just joined the public service and are waiting to be deployed into their various positions and stations. What this is targeting is that the public servants who are coming in, the people who are joining the public service, should be oriented to the norms and ethics and values of public service, so that they can be able to function and know how government functions. Then we have the in-service training. This one is targeted for those that have served in the public service for at least 2 years. And what this is doing is basically to reorient, to bring back those ethos of public service to the people, because we have noticed that over the years, we have kind of lost that touch, where the public service became so politicized to the extent that you could see the political divide even within particular offices. You would see who belongs to which political party. And we are saying that this is not the way that the public service should function. And we also have a module on promotion. This is targeted for those that are seeking to be promoted. And what this is that before one is promoted, in addition to the academic competences that one might have, the degrees, the diplomas, and so forth, they should also demonstrate competences that they are able to function at a particular position that they are seeking. So they have to undergo this training and pass the competence tests, examinations, which will now be, they'll be certified to say now this person is able or has passed this competence test. Therefore, they can be considered for a promotion, without which no one will be promoted. So when we are speaking about professionalization of the public service, I saw a question earlier which was saying, why should we be talking about professionalization of the public service when in fact the civil service is already professional? What we are saying, like, is it the previous professor that was just speaking, as well as the other one, what we are saying is that we need to bring back the thinking, the allegiance, the patriotism back to the public service, because, like in this case of a collision arrangement, we are going to have a lot of people from different political parties with different value systems and so forth. And so we need to bring these people to work together in one government with a view for service delivery, to enhance service delivery, to enhance government work, so that work of the state is not hampered because of our different ideologies and our value systems that we may have as individuals. And so this is where this professionalism comes in to enhance that aspect. So I just thought I should make mention of that, and also just highlight on what the National Institute of Public Administration here in Zambia is doing in order to enhance the professionalism of the public service. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wrap up. And then we go to Lesotho, Ms. Ntabiseng Tlomula, for your closing.
Okay, thank you very much, Doctor. I would like to just maybe as a sum up to again also emphasize the role of training and development in order to actually emphasize the issue of professionalism. Because as it was alluded to by one of the speakers, that the line is a bit blurred now between the role of the ministers and the role of the administration, mainly because of political interference. So it is important that public officers are really aware of their role in terms of ensuring that service delivery is enhanced, because we do have a serious challenge as far as service delivery is concerned, where we find quite a number of members of society always complaining about provision of services and also access to those services. So it is through training and professionalization of the public service that you can really get that far. And also of importance, again, is still the issue of the political and administrative interface. We have noted as Lesotho that it is a serious challenge. And now that you find that some of the principal secretaries were maybe standing for elections in their constituencies, and then they are appointed in government as principal secretaries, and they're supposed to work with ministers, you find that some of them are even very powerful in the political spaces in their own constituencies, more than the ministers. So when they get to the office, there's some sort of that friction. So it is important that the roles are clearly defined in order to ensure that there's no conflict and the work of business goes as the work of government goes well as expected. So with us, again, I'd like to emphasize the importance of having a national document like we do have the NSDP, where we are saying, as a nation, this is where we are going. This prevents a situation where every government, when it comes to power, they come up with their own package that this is where we want to go. After 2 years, they are out. Another party or coalition comes in with their own package that this is where we want to go. And at the end, we are not able to achieve anything. So when we have a national document clearly outlining where we want to go in terms of social development as a country, then we know that whichever government is in government, this is the way we are going. This is the route that we are going. And then there will be progress in as far as developments are concerned. So there was a question that I tried to answer regarding whether maybe the society and the members of civil society were okay that the change of government actually took place in government, that we didn't go for elections. Members of society were very much happy because for many years, we had to go for elections before a 5-year period. So a lot of money was being spent on elections until such a time that members of society were not satisfied. So they were very much thrilled by the move that change actually happened in parliament without going for elections, because a lot of money was saved. So with those words, I think it is the responsibility of us as professionals to ensure that we really are professional and ensure that during the period of change and transition, we carry on the business of government as expected, and service delivery is enhanced. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that input. Our next panelist to wrap up is Prof. Andrea Lippi from Italy. Thank you. We're happy that you managed to rejoin us. Thanks.
Thanks to you. Good morning.
Prof. Lippi, are you still here?
Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. If you have questions, I can reply to your question. I suppose you watched on the video I sent you on last Friday.
Yes.
Okay.
And people have been sharing some questions on the chat. So some of which you can share for us. Like, for example, do you guys have a deadlock breaking mechanism there in Italy? When there's a deadlock among the coalition partners, how do you deal with it? And then how do they manage government communications?
Oh, it's okay.
Government communications, like at times you find that this minister is talking, you're not sure whether they're talking on behalf of their party or from government. That babble of voices, how is it managed in Italy?
Oh, okay. I apologize because I mean now enter the chat. So I was reading the messages in the chat. If I understood, the main point is if you reply, please, is that what type of relationships in terms of communications between bureaucracy and politicians in government coalition. Is it right? Please correct me if it is not.
Yes, that is right. And also how the politicians, did you have a situation where it gets chaotic there, where when politicians, the ministers are communicating with the public, where they tend to be communicating on behalf of their parties rather than government?
Yes, it's a very good question, but very, very wide. And but it's very, very insightful. I try to give you a very, very concentrated reply. I think that of course I'm referring to the Italian experience now. In general, there are a two-level communication, a formal one and an informal one. The difference is absolutely relevant, especially looking at the Italian case. The difference between a formal communication and informal one is absolutely relevant because, as in an unusual motto, like a joke, the people are used to say what you are used to write is not the same you are used to tell the people. And so it means that in terms of formal communication between the representative bodies on the one side and the bureaucrats on the other one, you can look at a specific procedure of communication. And so the regulation and the law, the regulation envisages in a very, very detailed way the type of steps of messages and what can be told or not. But on the other side, you can look at a very thick and a networked type of informal communication by WhatsApp, by oral communication, by face-to-face communication. It means that the most part of the communication between politicians and the bureaucrats is informal. Then you can find a very formalized in written documents, but you can the contents are reduced at a minimum. The minimum. Do you understand? Is it clear for you? And the formal documents are very, 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 very minimal. The most part of the communication is informal through networking and face-to-face and the informal relationships. On the other side, the communication between the ministers and the staff, the ministers' staffs, with regard to the politicians and the member of parliaments, for instance, of the parties, is absolutely informal, absolutely made of by media or by the structure of the inside the parties. It's very important to keep in mind that there isn't any type of specific relationships between the parties and the bureaucrats. They are two independent bodies. I could tell you that the parties and the bureaucrats are ignoring themselves. And the parties are communicating to the ministers and to the members of the government through political channels and media channels, but it is a matter of politics. That's a matter of politics, political communication. On the other side, there is the type of communication I displayed between the ministers and the ministers' staffs and the cabinets too, including the cabinets too, and the bureaucrats. And this is very latent with regard to public opinion. I think that's the 99% of the Italian public opinion doesn't know anything about the relationships between the politicians and the bureaucrats. It's absolutely informal. And like in the American motto, smoking rooms, anyway, inside the rooms of the ministries. And these are very thick and very fruitful, very everyday communication, but absolutely far from public opinion, from public debate. So I don't know if my reply is sufficient, and don't hesitate to ask me further clarification. I will be happy to give you additional insights.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. We'll now move on to Prof. Buthelezi for your wrap-up remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Kaunda. So a couple of things. The first is just to say it's encouraging to hear the Lesotho example from Ms. Klomola, because it shows us on one hand that these are things that we can learn. We can learn how to make coalitions work and learn quite quickly. It seems like the current coalition is holding quite steady, and we can I think encourage ourselves that we'll get there as well. But of course, along the way, it's been pretty bumpy. Governments falling every 2 years, on average 2.5 years, it seems. And therefore, it also it should alert us that we might potentially have a bumpy ride ahead. But with the kind of international experience that we're learning from, that has been studied, that we're talking about in this webinar, we could smooth some of those bumps for ourselves as we go forward. The second thing I just want to touch on, Professor Figeni talked about the role of civil society. And I think that's one element that we again have not talked about enough and don't talk about enough. Professor Figeni talks about the need in this education that we're talking about, in the training we're talking about, of how to even have, I think, civil conversations, among other things, as civil society also needing to be part of that training. And I think that's absolutely right. One thing I want to underline is that there's often a strained relationship between civil society bodies, NGOs, activist movements, and the state and political office bearers. And I think this is a moment that calls for a recalibration of that relationship as well. I speak as somebody who works a lot in civil society networks, and I think there's the ways in which we could work in partnership, collaboratively, while holding one another accountable and not shying away from criticism where criticism is warranted. So I think there's part of a recalibration that I think this moment calls for, that we need to be open to. And then lastly, I just also want to say, I want to caution us to mind our language, how we talk about what the public service does. I've heard a couple of times talk of, in this webinar, of the public service serving the government of the day. And somebody has asked in the comments, does the public service serve the government of the day, or does it serve the populace, the people of South Africa? And I think we need to just be careful that we're not opening the door to the kind of politicization again that we are talking about getting out of our system when we talk about about the public service serving the government rather than serving the populace of the country. And I will end there. Thank you very much, Dr. Kaunda.
Thank you very much. And now over to Prof. Figeni for his closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much for this illuminating, webinar. I do think that maybe let's step back a moment. Between 36 million and 39 million people are 18 years and above in South Africa, therefore eligible to vote. But only 27 million are even registered to vote. And just over 16 million participated in the recent elections. and the largest party is just over 6 million. And the second largest is over 3.4 million. It tells us that the public generally has disengaged. As we talk about the function of public service, and we look at the Afrobarometer and look at the HSRC results and other results of the opinion surveys, which show legitimacy crisis, the crisis of relevance that has led to people in the last years not being as enthusiastic in participating in the public and civic life. So to me, to the point that Prof. Buthelezi was speaking to, we should be talking about a people-centered public service that is service-oriented, that is driven by national interest, not a partocracy on how some parties or a compendium of manifestos are put together, because it's clear that the parties, even as they win a minority of those who are participating. So that civil service, if it is informed by the Constitution, it's informed by the national interest, it's informed by what people need and is development-oriented. Even as they support their respective ministers, they will use this as a compass to guide. So how we frame our discussion should not be a party-focused or a minister-focused, but rather a people-focused, because this complaint that the elite, especially in a society that has become so unequal, they believe that the business class and the political class are there to serve themselves. And we can only assist that. Hence, we ought to be asking difficult questions in this professionalization space. Why an annual report that looks so elegant and speaks so beautifully about the achievements of a particular department, but the people who are serviced by that particular department feel so miserable? Why a Buffalo City municipality at times, when it finally achieved clean audit, the public is ready to have a doi-doi and demonstrate against the clean audit? What are the tools that have made us so alienated from the rest of the society? And that, to me, I think as we talk about professionalism, about professionalization, about coalition, we should be asking, what was the reason of creating government in the first place? What's the reason of a public servant in the first place? And that has to be felt through the lived experience of the people on the other side. Hence, across parties, that should be a glue, that should be the focal point, that should be a true North Star. Or else we could satisfy the few parties who gather around the table and have ministries when the society is drifting away from the system itself. And I just want to end up by saying, we have not even touched on the issue of parliamentary work and portfolio committees and how you relate to those as a professional. More so now that the situation is not as clear, as the ruling party will have a chairperson of this committee and so forth. It's going to be a lot more complex. So the complexity itself has now been brought to the table. And how do you deal with the situation where political parties have their own lehotla or retreat? They want an advice from a senior public servant. Do you go there? Do you participate in those? And what are the guidelines of that? Because it was taken for granted because the minister was from this party and the chair of the portfolio committee was from this party and every other person. So it was natural that you'd walk there, you'd participate, because the fusion between government and the party was rather there not to be seen in a way. So I do think that for me, it's those granular details that we should be looking at and grappling with when we talk of professionalism. But ultimately, the question of whether national interest or party interest or the interest of the elite, which is there at any given time, should be the guiding point. And how should this same bureaucracy in its professional posture assist the national dialogue that has to create consensus on what a new blueprint should be and what has not happened in the past 30 years and what should be happening going forward? And how do we mediate the space between the government planning process and these national dialogues, which could actually not be working in tandem? And therefore, one could be saying the nation says this, but the government says this. How do we make sure that the thinking, the psychology, the anticipation, and the orientation leads to convergence of those, solving the fundamental issues rather than the architecture of how bureaucracy functions and how politics interface with bureaucracy? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much. We started out with more than 700 participants, which demonstrates the interest and the importance of this topic as we navigate our new reality, which is the government of national unity. We now reached a phase where Prof. Busani Nzaweni, the principal of the National School of Government, will do a wrap-up and way forward. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Program Director Dr. Kaunda, and we truly appreciate all those who came out to engage with us today, especially our international guest from Maseru to Rome. Your inputs are appreciated. We will actually transcribe this session and send it to the politicians, those who are parties to the coalition, and others. Of course, it is live, so it was available on YouTube for many others to do, and we will be sharing some of the presentations as well. If you go to the chat platform before you exit, please do go there and download what has been shared with you. We will do a series, as Dr. Kaunda said, of these conversations in the coming week. Like next week, Friday, we want to bring politicians themselves into the platform, both local as well as international politicians who were at the coalface of managing coalitions and GNUs. In this instance today, you saw that majority of those who spoke are practitioners of one form or the other. We do need to create a space for politicians as well. We also run other type of topical issues. For example, this coming Friday, we have a webinar that will be engaging bureaucrats on how to manage mining contracts. It's a big topical issue in the African continent at the moment, with various experiences in countries like Ghana. We had bureaucrats who signed mining contracts with companies in return for the building of infrastructure. And later, you will have challenges in some African countries where you give someone a concession to run a mine for 20 years, the bridge will be built and the dam over 5 years. And the communities don't understand why people are continuing to mine beyond 7 years when the bridge and the dam has already been built. And then they expect it to cease to happen because the projects have been done, whereas it may take only 15 or 20 years for the company mining to recover all the costs it took them to build that particular infrastructure. And there's also some countries where there's conflict as a result of the type of mining agreements that are being signed. So please do join us on Friday. We have shared the link as well if you are interested to understand the dynamics of managing mining concessions. In a situation like ours, of course, those matters will arise in the course of engagement between the parties in a coalition environment. And we know in some cases where the new government comes, the first thing they want to do is to scrap all the contracts that were entered into by the previous government, believing that there may have been those who were benefiting from those type of mining contracts. So on Friday, we'll be engaging with experts from the African Development Bank and other countries who've had similar experiences. Well, today was a fruitful engagement, and thanks to all of you who made time to took half a day to engage. Here, there's few things that were said which stuck out for me and for many of you, and we'll be processing these things going forward. One of them is the significance of building consensus. That in any type of an arrangement, I suppose even in relationships where two parties decide to form a family, that there's got to be consensus and an agreement on the minimum program of action, because that is what then unites you. That is what must be common between you. We're not just an agglomeration of free thinking agents who can do whatever they want to do. A government, as the constitution is clear, says it's a unitary state. It's got various spheres, and that you must cooperate and coordinate with those spheres. And in this regard, it is important, therefore, that for this to succeed, there's got to be a consensus. And even if that consensus is reached, it must be something that can be implemented, because eventually this seventh administration will be measured on its ability to manage and implement that which it has agreed to as being the minimum program. The issues of trust have been emphasized across the board, so it's important that we build a system and structure that will encourage and cement trust. Of course, at the early stage, like now, things may happen, words may be said, people can be hurt, people can be misunderstood, and so on. But in the final analysis, as I outlined earlier on, as cabinet being the clearinghouse, as provincial ExCo being a clearinghouse, it should be possible, therefore, to build a system that is coherent, because there is no department that can make any decision on its own without that decision going through the central clearing system, which is cabinet or a provincial ExCo. But I think it's also emerging here that we must allow politicians to be politicians. That is what they are. Politicians are neither comedians, nor priests, nor bureaucrats. That is what they are. They are people who are there, elected to manage, political, interest, and that's in a genuine arrangement. Their responsibility is therefore to mediate those interests and make sure that there's a common program. But if, as sometimes scholars do, we substitute politicians for comedians or for priests or even for brain surgeons, we will be taking away the meaning of being a politician itself. And in fact, the risk is that there is this notion of South African exceptionalism, where we think a South African politician is different to a politician anywhere else in the world. Of course, there are public concerns and public expectations about what politicians ought to do and how they must behave and how they must drive a national agenda to advance society. But believing that politicians could cease to be politicians at particular points because they are trying too hard to show levels of professionalism and so on might in fact undermine and take away the very meaning of being a politician. Then, as we know, every politician across the world, when they go into elections, politicians are like peacocks. Peacocks, in Zulu, it's called ayasakabula. They are like peacocks. When they go to elections, any incumbent government will do a show and tell based on the work that they've been doing. To the extent that the electorate is convinced, they may vote you back. To the extent that they are not, they will vote you out, even though you are doing show and tell as peacocks, as peacocks will do. However, there is an emphasis being made, and Prof. Masrimula calls it professionalizing politicians. I have an argument to make, and we have to work on this and explore its parameters. What we need to do in South Africa, as some countries have done, is to reskill the politician, because the de-skilling of politicians over years has meant that politicians, they're expected to kiss babies, they're expected to go to where there are floods, they're expected to cut ribbons and so on. to the extent that they spend a lot more time doing show and tell, there's a lot of de-skilling that occurs here. And I think what is being emphasized now is that we must reskill our politicians so that they make quality decisions in the best interest of society. And in the GNU environment, they are making those best decisions in the best interest of society, regardless of which party they come from. So there has to be an investment in building a new cadre of politicians who are competent, who can make quality decisions, politicians who choose the best of the best options, not the least of the worst options. In countries like Italy and others who were here, of course, you find someone being a DG today, tomorrow is a minister, the following day is a chief justice, the other day the person could be the governor of the Reserve Bank. Because the civil service in those countries is arranged such that there are no limits. People can move around the system at various turns, at various points, and it is not seen to be odd if someone who was a politician could become a DG. Therefore, by reskilling politicians in South Africa, it will mean that there's many more career paths and career opportunities where a minister today could become a municipal manager tomorrow, and that must never be considered to be a demotion, because it's part and parcel of the career paths available in the civil service. Also, it was emphasized that we need to build shock absorbers in the system and know how to absorb various shocks, because those are certainly going to occur, which is important. The point that was raised by the last speaker from Italy, that you must find a way of breaking deadlock and managing shocks, and that it will be contingent on the extent to which parties are able to communicate both formally as well as informally. In one case in Europe where there was a coalition, I think in Ireland, you had the leaders of the leading parties meeting prior, processing issues before they could go even to cabinet. In other instances, you don't have that, but you do need anchors who will keep the system coherent. Finally, on the issue of public servants and the question of whether or not they are professional, and this is an age-old debate. They need to be engaged and debated by scholars and so on. It is my submission that in South Africa, by and large, we do have a professional civil service. There are problems, of course. Those will manifest through what the AG will write about when they do the report. They will manifest in the type of reports that the SIU will produce, as well as several other institutions. But by and large, I think the majority of public servants are very professional. What is required, however, is to give them more space. I have argued elsewhere, much to the anger of some of the people who read my argument and some politicians. The director generals in particular are not ball boys and ball girls of politicians. Let me repeat that. DGs and HODs and CEOs of public entities are not ball boys and ball girls of politicians. That what they must do is to be treated as a talented talent, an advanced detachment of thinkers and executors who work professionally with the politicians in their institutions and boards, if there is the case of a board, to execute the national mandate. If they reduce themselves in the manner in which they behave, in the manner in which they chase around politicians into being ball boys and ball girls, they will be treated as such. As we have learned from this webinar, in many cases or countries where you had this type of political situations, it is precisely the leadership shown by those who are at the upper echelons of that ministry. Those countries where all politicians also depend on a professional civil service for them to be able to manage these stormy waters and eventually to deliver on the national mandate. I argue, therefore, that we must create a situation where everybody returns to the simulator, especially the public servants. We're in chartered territories. You cannot use the same flying skills to drive or fly a department today that you did 7 years ago, because the situation has changed. It is the same for politicians as well. We need to return to the simulator because they have to negotiate arrangements, they have to negotiate deals, they have to make much more compromises today than they could have done before. If you take, for example, the land, proposal that went through Parliament a year ago. In a current, setup, it would be much more difficult to gain a 2/3 that will have been, prior, which means that we need this ability to negotiate, ability for brinkmanship, and to build consensus amongst parties if that type of a bill were to return to Parliament. I'm just using it as an example to show the type of complexities that politicians need to manage in this new era. Therefore, emphasize that we must return to the simulator, get new skills, and more, confidence and abilities to be able to manage the situation before us. Otherwise, as NSG, we do trust that you have learned something from this session. There's several others which are coming. Let's learn together so that we can serve the people of South Africa diligently. And whilst we do so, we must grow professionally as well. Thank you very much, Program Director. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Ngaweni. Actually, this is nice. 1 o'clock on the dot, we are done. Thank you very much to all our panelists from all over the world, really, from SADC to Italy to Belgium to Ireland. We really appreciate your inputs, and also all our participants from all 700 of you. And we're quite happy that even though we are wrapping up, it's been a long session, but there's still a huge number that exists, that is here listening to these discussions. Common message to all of us as public servants: therefore, we serve the government of the day. We are guided by the Public Service Act and the Constitution, and we continue serving diligently, professionally, efficiently, effectively, as much as we can. Your inputs, your participation is much appreciated. We look forward to hosting you again in the coming webinars, still dissecting the GNU and everything we need to do to make it a success for the sake of our country. Thank you very much. Adjourned. Goodbye.